When the 17th century began, Japan was emerging from a long age of civil war. The warlord Tokugawa Ieyasu won the struggle for supremacy, consolidated power at Edo, and accepted the title of shogun early in the century. Under the Tokugawa family, Japan built a political order that combined central authority with local autonomy. Historians often call this the Bakuhan system, a partnership between the Bakufu, or shogunal government, and the Han, or domain lords known as daimyo. The core goal was stability, and for more than 2.5 centuries, that goal mostly held. The Tokugawa system rested on several deliberate pillars. First came social hierarchy. Samurai occupied the top status as a service elite tied by stipends to their lords. Below them stood peasants, who grew rice and paid taxes assessed through the kokudaka system, an estimate of yield that financed the entire regime. Artisans and merchants followed. This hierarchy was justified by Neo-Confucian ideas that prized order, loyalty, and proper roles. Second came administrative control. Daimyo governed their domains, but the shogunate restricted their movement and wealth. The most famous tool was alternate attendance, or sankin kotai. From the 1630s onward, daimyo were required to spend alternating years in Edo and in their home territories, while their wives and heirs often remained in Edo as a kind of human guarantee of loyalty. The travel and upkeep costs drained domain treasuries, tied lords to the capital, and fostered a national culture through constant movement along the great highways. A third pillar was carefully managed foreign relations. The regime faced a world where European powers were building empires across the seas. Missionaries had entered Japan in the previous century, and communities of Christian converts existed in parts of Kyushu. The Tokugawa leadership concluded that uncontrolled contact threatened social order. In the 1630s, after the violent Shimabara rebellion of Christian peasants and ronin, the shogunate expelled most missionaries and restricted European merchants to a tiny artificial island at Nagasaki called Dejima. The Dutch were allowed because they agreed to trade without missionizing. Chinese merchants could also come, and limited tribute-style relations continued with the Ryukyu Kingdom and with Korea through the Tsushima domain. In other words, Japan did not disappear from the map. Instead, it created a set of narrow gateways it could monitor and tax. This policy later gained the label sakoku, meaning closed country, though it is more accurate to think of it as selective engagement under strict rules. The logic behind controlled contact was straightforward. If outside ideas could disturb religious and social stability, then limit them. If foreign goods and silver could strengthen the domains in the center, then channel them through ports the government watched. The effect was a long peace. Without large wars to fight, samurai turned into bureaucrats and teachers. Urban centers grew. Edo became one of the most populous cities in the world. Osaka served as a national market for rice and other goods, and Kyoto remained a cultural capital. Crafts, theater, and publishing flourished. The spread of terrakoya, or neighborhood schools, gave commoners practical literacy and numeracy, feeding a vibrant print culture of almanacs, guides, and fiction. Stability made this possible. Prosperity, in turn, reinforced the regime. Yet stability came with costs. Because samurai stipends were paid in rice while commerce moved in coin, domain and household budgets often fell out of balance. Merchants, officially low in status, gained quiet power as lenders. Periodic famines and crop failures exposed the thin margins that supported peasant households. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, several crises struck in sequence. The Tenmei famine and later the Tempo crisis brought hunger, higher prices, and unrest. Reformers within the government tried to respond. Some, like Matsudaira Sadanobu in the late 18th century, emphasized moral retrenchment and austerity. Others, like Mizuno Tadakuni in the Tempo era, attempted economic controls and urban regulations. These measures had mixed results, and they revealed a key weakness. A system built to prevent change struggled to manage it. At the same time, the world beyond Japan's shores was changing rapidly. Russian explorers and traders probed the North Pacific. In the late 18th century and early 19th century, they approached the Kuril Islands and Hokkaido, prompting the shogunate to pay more attention to its northern frontier. Officials such as Matsura Takashiro mapped Izochi, the broader region that included Hokkaido and Sakhalin, while domain agents and the central government expanded fortifications. Encounters at sea multiplied as American and European whalers entered the northern waters, sometimes seeking shipwrecked sailors or fresh supplies. The British Phaeton incident in Nagasaki in the early 19th century embarrassed local authorities and led to stricter coastal defense orders. The Morrison incident in the late 1830s, in which a foreign ship carrying castaway Japanese sailors was fired upon and driven away under existing expulsion edicts, further exposed the contradiction between humanitarian concerns and isolationist rules. These contacts pressed another question: how much foreign knowledge should be allowed in to defend against foreigners? The answer came through a small but influential channel known as Dutch learning, or rangaku. Because the Dutch maintained a trade presence in Nagasaki, books and experts could, with permission, transmit European ideas in medicine, astronomy, and later military science. Scholars such as Sugita Genpaku translated anatomical texts. Later figures like Takano Chue and Watanabe Kazan called for more openness to study Western methods, and they were punished under laws that feared subversion. But the debates continued. By the early 19th century, a number of samurai administrators realized that coastal batteries, gunnery, and modern shipbuilding could not be advanced by isolation alone. Igawa Hidetatsu along the eastern seaboard sponsored artillery foundries and coastal defense plans. Takashima Shuhan demonstrated Western-style gunnery in the early 1840s. These were limited experiments, yet they signaled a growing understanding. If the world was coming closer, Japan had to master parts of it to survive. Minds were changing in another way as well. Intellectual movements inside Japan reimagined the nation's past and the source of legitimate authority. Kokugaku, or national learning, pioneered by thinkers such as Motori Norinaga in the previous century, urged a return to ancient texts and Shinto traditions. While scholarly in tone, Kokugaku offered a language through which later activists could claim the emperor as the spiritual center of the nation. In the early 19th century, Aizawa Seishisai of the Mito school wrote a widely read text that warned of foreign threats and argued for unity under imperial reverence. His sharp phrase, "Revere the emperor and expel the barbarians," did not yet guide national policy, but it provided a rallying cry that some domains would later adopt. Here again is cause and effect. The presence of outside pressure encouraged inward-looking ideas, and those ideas could be used against the existing shogunal order when the moment came. That moment arrived with unmistakable force in the early 1850s. Across the Pacific, the United States had grown into a continental power with a blue water navy and a commercial appetite for coaling stations and markets in Asia. American whalers needed ports of refuge. Traders and missionaries looked toward China and beyond. Washington decided that opening Japanese ports by treaty would serve these interests. Commodore Matthew Perry received the task and sailed west with steam-driven ships that belched smoke and carried modern cannon. The Japanese public later called them the Black Ships for good reason. They looked like a new age arriving at the horizon. When Perry anchored off Uraga in the summer of 1853, he demanded, with careful ceremony and implied threat, that a letter from the president be accepted and that negotiations begin. The Tokugawa government faced a dilemma no prior shogun had confronted at this scale. Firing on the squadron risked disaster. Ignoring it risked humiliation and more dangerous returns. Negotiating under pressure risked committing the country to a path the old rules could not manage. The initial response was to receive the letter and request that Perry return the following year for a formal answer, buying time to consult. The scramble that followed inside Japan revealed how much had changed beneath the surface of Tokugawa order. The shogunate canvassed opinion from major domains, including those that had once been its fiercest foes, like Satsuma and Choshu. Some officials, influenced by rangaku, argued that limited opening was unavoidable and that learning from the West was necessary to build modern defenses. Others insisted that any treaty under threat would betray the realm and called for expulsion. For the first time in generations, the center asked the regions for counsel on a national crisis, and the regions began to act like national actors. Meanwhile, coastal defenses were hurriedly upgraded. Batteries at Odaiba in Edo Bay took shape. Shipyards experimented with Western-style designs. Interpreters and officials reviewed Dutch-language documents to anticipate American demands. Even the emperor's court in Kyoto, usually distant from executive decision-making, returned to relevance as some daimyo sought imperial approval for policies on foreign relations. This shift hints at the next era. Appeals to imperial authority would soon become a lever to pry power away from the shogunate. The arrival of the black ships also exposed deep economic tensions. Funding emergency defenses required money from already stretched domain and central budgets. Merchants who supplied materials gained influence, while samurai on fixed stipends felt the pressure of rising prices and new taxes. Townspeople watched the foreign ships with curiosity and fear. Rumors coursed through Edo's streets. The regime's legitimacy had rested on keeping the seas quiet and the borders secure. Now both looked uncertain. To understand why Perry's visit mattered so much, it helps to connect the long arc of the Tokugawa centuries. The system had created internal peace, a common culture, and a national market. It had also produced learned officials who could master foreign sciences when permitted. These were strengths, but the same system had discouraged institutional flexibility, limited independent diplomacy by the center, and spread the costs of stability unevenly. When a modern naval power demanded treaties, the shogunate had neither modern warships to compel respect nor a constitutionally solid foundation to share decision-making across the realm. The result was confusion, contestation, and an opening for ambitious reformers. There were human voices at the time that captured the mood. Tokugawa Ieyasu's old maxim, "Life is like carrying a heavy load over a long road, keep going and do not rush," had guided officials for generations. In 1853, that counsel sounded steady but perhaps outdated. Younger samurai in the southwestern domains whispered a different lesson. If the world was moving, Japan must move with it or be pushed aside. In Edo, senior counselors tried to manage a crisis with tools designed for a gentler age. In Nagasaki, Dutch merchants served as reluctant intermediaries translating between two systems that hardly understood each other. No one yet knew exactly what would follow, but most understood that the old equilibrium was broken. The crisis unleashed by foreign pressure did not end with negotiation. It triggered a transfer of power and a race to rebuild the state from the ground up. In Kyoto, court nobles and reformist domains moved quickly to reclaim national authority in the name of the young emperor. When imperial troops and allied domains confronted the shogun's remaining forces at Toba and Fushimi in the opening weeks of the Restoration conflict, the balance tipped. Within months, the coalition pressed north, taking Edo with a negotiated surrender that spared the city from ruin. A final stand in the far north at the star-shaped fortress of Goryokaku ended when the last shogunal loyalists yielded. The political center shifted decisively from the old military government to a new regime that claimed to rule in the emperor's name. What followed was not a simple return to ancient ways, but a deliberate project of modern nation-building. The new leadership, figures like Okubo Toshimichi of Satsuma, Kido Takayoshi of Choshu, Saigo Takamori, Iwakura Tomomi, and later Ito Hirobumi and Yamagata Aritomo, shared a conviction that survival required rapid institutional change. They announced their intent in a brief but consequential statement known as the Charter Oath. Its clauses promised deliberative assemblies, social mobility based on ability, a unified national effort, and the pursuit of knowledge from the world to strengthen imperial rule. The oath offered a guiding idea. The state would mine global experience to transform Japan while insisting that the emperor's authority was the source of legitimacy. One of the first challenges was administrative, how to break the power of hundreds of semi-autonomous domains without plunging the country back into civil war. The answer emerged step by step. The court appointed loyal domain leaders as imperial governors. then encouraged and pressured them to return their lands and people to the throne. In a bold move a few years later, the government replaced all domains with centralized prefectures, staffed by officials appointed from the capital. This abolition of the domain system, remembered as Heihan Chiken, was the pivotal act of centralization. It tied tax collection, policing, and public works to a single authority, and ended the patchwork sovereignty that had defined the Tokugawa centuries. Centralization demanded money. To finance a modern state, the government overhauled the fundamental relationship between land, labor, and revenue. Under the Tokugawa order, taxes had been assessed on estimated rice yields. The new regime converted that system into a monetary land tax based on assessed property value. Landholders received formal titles, and the tax was set at a stable rate in currency rather than in rice. This brought predictability to government income, encouraged a national money economy, and linked rural producers to markets. It also produced hardship, where assessments were heavy or yields fluctuated, prompting protests that officials learned to manage with adjustments and explanations. Security was the next pillar. The new leaders did not want to rely on domain militias that owed their loyalty to local lords. Inspired by European models, advisors such as Omura Masujiro argued for a national army recruited from the entire population. The government enacted universal conscription, declaring that every household would share the burden of national defense. This was a radical break. The sword was no longer the hereditary tool of the samurai alone. Resistance flared. In towns and villages, crowds chanted that the new law was a blood tax, and riots erupted against officials and symbols of the state. The government held its ground, using force where necessary and outreach where possible. Yamagata Aritomo would turn this principle into a doctrine, organizing a conscript army on regional lines, building training schools, and laying foundations for a general staff. Reform spread into education. Leaders believed that modern warfare, industry, and administration required literate citizens who could read orders, operate machinery, and participate in public life. A national education order mandated schools in every locality. Curriculum planners studied French and later German and American models, designing a ladder from primary classes to new universities. Teacher training colleges opened, and thousands of students enrolled. Private academies multiplied, mixing Confucian classics with mathematics, geography, and foreign languages. In this way, the state fused older habits of learning with new content, creating pathways for upward mobility that did not depend on birth alone. Infrastructure stitched the new nation together. Engineers and financiers planned roads, telegraph lines, lighthouses, and harbors. Most dramatically, they built railways. The first railway linked the capital's new business district with the treaty port that had served foreign trade for decades, shrinking travel times and symbolizing progress. Telegraph wires accompanied the tracks, allowing provincial officials to communicate instantly with ministries in Tokyo. A modern postal service went into operation, extending the reach of the state into distant villages and small islands. These projects had multiplying effects. Moving troops became quicker, taxes and goods traveled more reliably. Newspapers reached new readers, and shared time schedules taught people to live by the clock. The government also reorganized religion and ritual to help bind subjects to the throne. In the early Restoration years, officials separated Buddhism and Shinto, reviving ancient rites and elevating the emperor's role as a symbol of unity. Shrines received administrative oversight, and a campaign of moral teaching sought to merge loyalty to family, village, and ruler into a single civic identity. At the same time, many communities protected Buddhist temples and customs, keeping religious life plural in practice. The larger point was political. The regime needed a story that explained rapid change as a return to authentic tradition, with the emperor as the timeless center even as modern ministries, courts, and schools proliferated around him. To keep the transformation moving, the leadership studied the world firsthand. A large delegation of statesmen, students, and specialists embarked on a multi-year mission to the United States and Europe, observing parliaments, arsenals, shipyards, factories, universities, and farms. They sought revision of the unequal treaties but soon realized that Japan would need deep legal and administrative reforms to gain full diplomatic standing. The mission returned with a long list of recommendations: rewrite the legal codes, standardize currency and weights, modernize the civil service, and invite foreign experts to teach. On their advice, the government hired hundreds of engineers, jurists, and teachers from abroad, while sending promising young Japanese to study medicine in Germany, naval architecture in Britain, agriculture in the United States, and law in France. Knowledge moved in both directions by design. Finance and industry advanced by a strategy later summarized as encouragement and protection. Ministries built model enterprises, shipyards, textile mills, glassworks, arsenals, to prove techniques and train managers. Once these plants showed a profit, the state sold many of them to private investors, often to families with the capital and networks to expand quickly. From these sales and from close ties to banks emerged conglomerates that would later be known for their scale and reach. The government offered them favorable loans, contracts, and tariff shelter, expecting them to deliver ships, rails, guns, and exports that would power national strength. The blueprint was not purely copied. It adapted European practice to Japanese realities, mixing bureaucratic direction with entrepreneurial drive. Not all experiments succeeded. Some factories failed, some mines proved dangerous, and the rapid turnover of currency in the early years led to inflation and fiscal strain. Statesmen debated whether to move faster or slower, to borrow abroad or avoid debt, to prioritize heavy industry or consumer goods. Okuma Shigenobu advocated bold financial policies and parliamentary reforms. Others cautioned against political liberalization while the state was still fragile. Out of these arguments came a gradual consensus that constitutional government would be promised but delayed, and that fiscal stabilization must accompany growth. The mint standardized coinage, a national bank system took shape, and efforts to manage paper currency issuance aimed to calm markets. The human consequences were everywhere visible. Samurai, relieved of their hereditary stipends when the government converted them into interest-bearing bonds, faced a painful adjustment. Some opened schools or newspapers, others sought work in the new ministries. Many struggled as prices rose and bond income fell. A number of disaffected warriors formed patriotic societies criticizing what they saw as the government's softness toward foreign powers and the loss of samurai privilege. Protest sometimes turned violent, not only in cities, but also in rural districts where tax burdens and market shocks cut deep. The state responded with a mixture of reform and repression. Police forces expanded, courts standardized punishments, and local assemblies gave residents limited channels to voice grievances. Frontier policy brought another dimension. To secure the northern approaches and exploit resources, the government created a development commission for Hokkaido. Surveyors mapped forests and rivers. Settlers, many of them former samurai, moved north to farm, and American agricultural techniques were introduced for the harsh climate. Alongside these projects came policies that marginalized indigenous Ainu communities, restricting traditional livelihoods and imposing assimilation. The pattern revealed a central lesson of the era. State building combined opportunity and coercion, opening new possibilities while narrowing old ones. Foreign policy remained a tightrope. The new army and navy needed modern weapons, but treaty powers limited tariffs and legal jurisdiction, constraining revenue and sovereignty. The government worked to renegotiate these terms by demonstrating legal reform at home. Western-style codes and courts were drafted with the help of foreign jurists. Law schools trained a new generation of judges and advocates. Diplomats presented these changes as proof that Japan was a civilized state under the standards of the day. Although full revision would take longer, the groundwork in this decade was essential. Within the leadership, unity frayed over the direction of expansion. A major dispute erupted over whether to launch a punitive expedition to the Korean peninsula to demand diplomatic recognition and open trade by force. Saigo Takamori and others argued that honor and security required decisive action. Okubo Toshimichi, supported by Kido and many who had just studied abroad, countered that the state was not ready for a foreign war. The anti-expedition view prevailed, and those who favored immediate action resigned. The outcome mattered in two ways. It kept scarce resources focused on domestic consolidation, and it planted the seeds of later rebellion by samurai, who believed the government had betrayed martial values. The new government had survived revolt and centralized power. But the next challenge was harder, turning improvised reforms into a durable state and a modern economy. From the late 1870s onward, Japan's leaders sought to bind authority, law, and industry together so that national strength would no longer depend on emergency measures or a handful of heroic administrators. The result was a decade of intense institution building, contested politics, and rapid industrial change under the banner so often repeated that it became a national creed, a rich nation, and a strong army. On the military side, the lesson of the recent domestic war was unmistakable. Victory had come not from the bravery of a few, but from organization, railways, telegraph, and modern weapons. In the summer of 1878, the army created a general staff to plan operations independent of day-to-day ministerial politics. Yamagata Aritomo, a strategist who had studied European models, pushed for a territorial system of divisions, mobilization districts, and reserves. The aim was to make war planning routine rather than improvised and to ensure that commanders answered ultimately to the throne through professional channels. A few years later, the rescript to soldiers and sailors framed military service as a sacred duty, demanding loyalty to the emperor above faction or party. These changes made the armed forces a state within the state, professional enough to fight abroad and insulated enough to resist civilian pressure. The Navy followed a parallel path. Shipyards expanded along the inland sea, and procurement missions ordered steel cruisers and guns from British yards. Naval officers studied in Portsmouth and at gunnery schools modeled on British practice, while engineers adapted new technologies like quick-firing artillery and torpedoes. Subventions and mail contracts sustained private steamship lines that could be turned to military transport in crisis. This naval buildup was expensive, but the ministries justified it with a simple calculus. Islands and trade required sea power, and sea power required both ships and industrial capacity to maintain them. Industrial policy and finance therefore moved to the center of national strategy. In the early 1880s, inflation, uneven paper currency, and fiscal deficits threatened to undermine the very modernization that the state demanded. The finance minister Matsukata Masayoshi imposed sharp austerity, selling off state factories that could not be managed efficiently by the bureaucracy, cutting expenditures, and contracting the money supply. This so-called Matsukata deflation was painful. Farmers lost land to tax arrears and falling prices, and rural unrest rose. Yet the stabilization restored confidence in the currency and drew foreign silver and gold into the economy through a surge in exports, particularly raw silk spun by peasant households and cotton yarn from new mills. The policy's logic was harsh but clear. A stable currency would permit long-term investment, a credible treasury would lower borrowing costs, and private entrepreneurs would run factories better than overstretched ministries. As state plants were sold, a new constellation of private enterprises rose to national importance. Merchant families and financiers acquired shipyards, mines, warehouses, and mills, often under favorable terms that reflected the government's desire to seed large-scale industry quickly. From these deals and from privileged access to banks and contracts emerged powerful industrial groups. Shipbuilding and shipping linked to one house, banking and trading to another, copper and chemicals to a third, and so on. Critics accused the finance ministry of creating private monopolies. Officials answered that only such concentrated capital could compete with European and American firms. Either way, the consequence was a public-private alliance. The state set goals and supplied protection or subsidies. The conglomerates invested, produced, and profited. And together they pushed railways, merchant fleets, and arsenals forward. If money and machines were essential, law and legitimacy were just as vital. From the late 1870s, intellectuals and activists outside the government built a movement for representative institutions. The Freedom and People's Rights movement organized petition campaigns, local rallies, and newspapers arguing that taxation required consent and that citizens should have a voice in national policy. Leaders like Itagaki Taisuke pressed for an elected assembly and a written constitution. Their pressure mattered. Amid scandal over proposed land sales and disputes inside the cabinet, the government announced a promise. A national assembly would be convened by a fixed date in the next decade. The pledge was a tactic to buy time, but it set an immovable clock. Administrators now had to design a constitution robust enough to secure imperial authority and flexible enough to satisfy the demand for representation. To draft that document, the leadership turned to Ito Hirobumi, who traveled to Europe to study constitutional monarchies. He looked closely at Prussia and other German states, where strong executive power coexisted with parliaments and modern legal systems. What attracted him was not the letter of foreign law, but a framework, sovereignty vested in the monarch, ministers responsible to the crown rather than to shifting party majorities, civil rights granted by law but limited by public order, and a diet that could debate budgets and statutes while leaving the core prerogatives of the throne intact. Returning home, Ito oversaw the creation of a privy council to review constitutional drafts in secrecy, and he recruited German jurists to help design civil and criminal codes and the judicial hierarchy. While the constitution took shape, the administrative map continued to harden into a national system. In the mid-1880s, the government introduced a cabinet form to clarify ministerial responsibility and to elevate the prime minister to a coordinating role. The Home Ministry expanded its authority over prefectural police, public order, and local government, ensuring that elections, when they came, would occur within a framework the center controlled. Press and assembly laws licensed printers and required permits for public meetings, allowing activists to speak, but also giving officials tools to suspend newspapers or disperse crowds that crossed lines set by regulation. The balance was delicate. Enough freedom to claim legitimacy, enough control to prevent sudden overturn. Education cemented the cultural foundations of the regime. Earlier efforts had built schools. Now policymakers sought uniform spirit as well as uniform curriculum. In the late 1880s, the government reorganized the entire system through education orders that stressed national morality alongside practical learning. The capstone arrived with the Imperial Rescript on Education, a brief exhortation that linked filial piety, loyalty, and public service to the person of the emperor. Schoolchildren memorized and recited its lines at ceremonies. Teachers taught ethics through its phrasing, and principals displayed it as a talisman of civic duty. Universities multiplied professional faculties in law, engineering, and medicine, training civil servants, judges, and engineers to staff the new institutions. The message was consistent. Technical skill and moral unity would advance together, guided from the center. The legal system itself became an argument in diplomacy. Ever since the treaties of the mid-19th century, foreign residents had enjoyed extraterritorial rights, tried in consular courts rather than by Japanese judges. To revise those humiliating clauses, the government needed to prove that its codes and courts met global standards. With foreign advisors, it established a layered court system, from local tribunals to a Supreme Court, and codified procedures that looked familiar to European jurists. Commercial law protected contracts. Criminal law defined offenses and punishments. A bar of trained advocates emerged. Diplomats could now point not only to promises, but to statutes and institutions as evidence that Japan deserved legal equality. In the countryside, the social effects of currency stabilization and export growth were complex. Household silk production linked remote hamlets to international markets. Girls and young women traveled to mill towns for seasonal work, sending remittances home and learning the rhythms of factory life. New agricultural tools and fertilizers, promoted by model farms and textbooks, raised yields where families could afford them. Yet vulnerability persisted. A poor harvest or a drop in global prices could still force a sale of land. Tenant contracts multiplied, and disputes over rents and water rights sometimes flared into local protest. The The state watched closely. Police mediated conflicts, school teachers preached thrift and hygiene, and prefectural assemblies, established as a cautious nod to local voice, debated budgets within tight constraints set by the Home Ministry. Urban society changed just as rapidly. Steam trams and horse railways knit neighborhoods to ports and depots. Telegraph offices joined post offices as landmarks of a new rhythm of time and information. Newspapers reported diet debates abroad and petition drives at home, shaping public opinion even when censored. Entrepreneurs opened banks, insurance companies, and trading houses. Students formed literary circles and political clubs, sometimes shadowed by informers. The idea of society itself, public opinion, civic association, the press, gained weight alongside the enduring authority of family and village. As the constitutional deadline approached, Ito and his colleagues resolved the last pieces of institutional architecture. The peerage system elevated former court nobles and prominent ex-daimyo into a titled aristocracy that would sit in an upper chamber. Electoral rules for the lower house limited the franchise to a small slice of adult men who paid a high property tax, ensuring that only wealthier taxpayers could vote at first. The budget rules required that ordinary expenditure receive legislative approval while setting aside certain imperial and military prerogatives. The emperor would promulgate laws, command the army and navy, and appoint ministers. The Diet would deliberate and approve statutes and funds. The Privy Council would stand as guardian of the fundamental law. It was a careful compromise, modernity without surrender of sovereign mystique. When the Constitution was proclaimed in the late winter of 1889, it was presented as a gift from the emperor to his loyal subjects. Ceremonies filled the capital with ritual and spectacle. Yet the meaning lay less in the pageantry than in the habits the document would force. Regular sessions of a national legislature would bring ministers to account in debate. Parties would organize to win seats and to bargain over budgets. Newspapers would report and criticize. Even limited suffrage would create a class of voters accustomed to weighing promises against performance. And the armed forces, anchored in their independent chains of command, would watch politics with a sense of corporate identity and imperial duty. By the early 1890s, Japan's new institutions had moved from blueprint to working machinery, and the arena where they would be tested lay across the straits on the Korean peninsula. Korea was formally a tributary of the Qing court, but reformers in Seoul argued for sovereign modernization, while conservative factions looked to Beijing for protection. For Tokyo's leadership, the peninsula was both a security buffer and a litmus test of status. If Japan could not influence events in a land so near and so strategic, its claim to equal standing among powers would ring hollow. The fuse that led to war was lit by domestic turmoil in Korea, international rivalry, and the newly confident capacity of the Japanese state. The immediate spark came from the Tonghak movement, a religious and social protest that gathered peasants, artisans, and discontented rural folk under a banner that mixed spiritual revival with demands for justice. When the movement rose in arms, the Korean court appealed to Qing authorities for help, invoking the old tributary ties. Troops from North China crossed by sea to steady the monarchy and push the rebels back. Tokyo seized upon the move to claim a treaty right of co-intervention, sending its own forces to Korea on the grounds that order and reform were necessary to protect Japanese interests and residents. The question at once became larger than rebellion. Who would write the rules of Korean reform, and who would guarantee them with force? Diplomatic cables flashed between Tokyo and Beijing, each side invoking precedent. The Qing statesman Li Hongjiang argued that, as the traditional suzerain, his government retained responsibility to suppress disorder and advise the Korean throne. Japanese ministers countered that modern international law recognized Korea as an independent state, and that any violation of sovereignty, whether by rebels or by foreign tutors, threatened regional peace. Behind these legal words stood soldiers, transport ships, and timetable calculations. On both sides, leaders knew that a clash might come, and that the first week would set the tone. Fighting began at sea. Off the western coast of Korea, Japanese cruisers engaged Chinese transports and their escort. The clash was brief but decisive, and the loss of men and material meant that Qing reinforcements would arrive slowly and under threat. The advantage allowed Japanese columns to move inland and secure points near Seoul. Once the capital was under their influence, Tokyo pressed for a reform cabinet that would be less beholden to Beijing and more open to administrative change. The move angered the Qing court, and it fortified forts and crossings along the northern approaches, counting on river barriers and seasoned troops to hold the line. On land, the first clear test came near Seongwan, where Japanese infantry and artillery, moving swiftly where roads allowed and improvising where they did not, turned a defensive position and sent Qing units northward. The fall of Pyongyang followed, accomplished through pressure on multiple approaches and the careful use of field guns that had been trained and supplied through the new conscription and logistics systems at home. The path to the Great River frontier was open. At the Yalu, Japanese and Qing forces met again. Naval gunfire and pontoons played their part, but it was the coordination between army units and fleet cover that broke the defensive cohesion. As the Japanese army crossed, sailors and gunners at sea met the Beiyang fleet in a fierce engagement off the Yellow Sea. The Chinese ships fought hard, with several displaying gallantry under fire, yet superior Japanese gunnery, tactical training, and damage control carried the day. With the river line broken, the campaign acquired a new axis. Some Japanese formations turned down the Liaodong Peninsula toward Port Arthur, a base that guarded access to the northern seas and housed arsenals and dry docks. Others advanced into southern Manchuria to threaten the arteries that connected the Qing heartland to Korea. Port Arthur fell after a concentrated assault. The capture of that harbor, along with nearby forts, gave Japan a forward naval base and a bargaining chip of real weight. North, across the Gulf, the fortress of Wei Highway anchored the remaining strength of the Beiyang fleet, but coordinated land and sea operations would soon make its position untenable. Japanese troops, ferried and supplied by an expanding merchant and naval fleet, landed on the Shandong coast, fought their way to the landward side of the harbor, and forced a double pressure that the defenders could not relieve. With the fleet battered and the fortress encircled, Qing negotiators sought terms. Cause and effect were stark. Years of building a general staff, training conscripts, purchasing modern guns, and constructing warships had created a force that could plan multi-theater operations and keep them supplied. The Navy's ability to shield troop convoys and engage enemy capital ships meant that the Army could fight on ground of its choosing. Telegraph lines and staff maps allowed colonels and admirals to coordinate movements across sea and land. The industrial policy that grew spinning mills and foundries also made shells and rails. The education policy that drilled schoolchildren in uniform time delivered officers and clerks who could calculate marches and inventories. The political payoff was obvious in Tokyo. Newspapers hailed victories, diet debates approved war credits, and the notion that Japan had stepped onto the world stage gained momentum. The human cost was also clear. In Liaodong and around Port Arthur, reports of atrocities shocked foreign observers and stained Japan's reputation, even as diplomats praised its discipline elsewhere. Journalists, missionaries, and neutral officers offered clashing accounts, and controversy followed in foreign presses. At home, officials argued that the speed and violence of modern war explained brutality without excusing it. For a government eager to prove its civilization according to Western standards, this moment revealed a tension that would recur, the drive for decisive action versus the demands of humane conduct under international scrutiny. Negotiations took place in a southern Japanese port city. Li Hongzhang, the seasoned statesman who had long managed foreign affairs for the Qing, traveled to meet plenipotentiaries from Tokyo. An assassination attempt on Li by a Japanese nationalist outraged world opinion and embarrassed the host, prompting apologies and an elevation of terms to show magnanimity. The resulting treaty announced several major changes to the regional order. China formally recognized the full and complete independence of Korea, undercutting the old tributary framework. Japan received Taiwan and the Pescadores, a cluster of islands that would serve as a forward base in the southern seas. The Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, was ceded, and large indemnities were promised, payable in silver. Commercial arrangements opened treaty ports and granted Japanese subjects rights to trade and travel in new areas along the Chinese coast and rivers. Each clause mattered for a different reason. Independence for Korea did not settle who would dominate its politics, but it removed the old legal cover under which Beijing had intervened. Territorial gains in Taiwan and the Pescadores gave Japan its first full overseas colony with all the challenges of governance, policing, and development that would entail. The Liaodong cession placed the empire at the threshold of Manchuria, a region rich in resources and coveted by other powers. Indemnities in hard currency promised to fuel industrial investment, fund railroad expansion, and pay for the next generation of warships. Trade concessions signaled that Japan, once constrained by unequal treaties, could now shape commercial rules for others. Yet triumph met its first shock almost at once. Russia, Germany, and France issued a joint warning, quickly remembered in Japan as the Triple Intervention, that advised Tokyo to return the Liaodong Peninsula to Chinese sovereignty on the grounds that its possession by Japan threatened the capital region and the balance of power. The message was clear. Victory on the battlefield did not guarantee freedom of action in the diplomacy of empires. Japan, lacking allies and facing the naval weight of 3 European powers, accepted the demand in exchange for additional indemnities. The humiliation cut deep. In newspapers and political clubs, writers spoke of national dignity. In the army and navy, planners drew lessons about Russia's intentions in the north and Germany's ambitions along the northern Chinese coast. The emotional residue of that intervention would feed the logic of future rearmament and confrontation. Taiwan presented a different kind of test. Even as the treaty transferred sovereignty, local elites announced a short-lived republic, and armed resistance spread across the island. Japanese forces spent months suppressing guerrilla bands and occupying key towns. Then began the work of building roads, registering land, combating disease, and establishing a colonial administration. The project forced the government to define what kind of empire it intended to run, extractive and punitive or developmental and bureaucratic. In practice, it became both, with public health campaigns and infrastructure projects alongside tight policing and limits on political expression. The island would later be held up as a model colony by Japanese administrators, but its early years were marked by hard fighting and heavy-handed rule. Inside Japan, the war altered politics as well as pride. The Diet had begun as a forum for cautious budget bargaining. War transformed it into an arena where parties could claim national purpose while still pressing for fiscal oversight. Cabinets learned to build coalitions with party leaders to pass military appropriations, and party leaders learned that association with victory brought votes. The emperor's public role expanded through reviews of troops and visits to shrines honoring the war dead, rituals that wove the monarchy more tightly into the imagined community of a modern nation at arms. School textbooks memorialized the campaign with maps and portraits of admirals and generals, linking the classroom to the battlefield in a way that earlier decades had only promised. For the Qing Empire, defeat launched a painful period of self-examination. Reformers in Beijing and in provincial capitals called for new armies, modern education, and administrative change. The scramble by European powers for leases and zones of influence along the Chinese coast accelerated, with German, Russian, French, and British flags appearing over new enclaves and rail concessions. Japan's victory had not brought lasting security. It had helped unsettle the regional order, inviting larger players to stake claims in the very zones where Japan hoped to expand its influence. That irony was not lost on Tokyo's strategists. They had forced the door open. Now they had to hold the doorway against bigger hands. Strategically, the most consequential consequence of the war was psychological and geographic. Psychological, because elites in Tokyo now believed that their state could defeat a venerable continental empire, coordinate land and sea power, and compel diplomatic concessions, beliefs that would shape risk calculations in the years ahead. Geographic, because the arc from the Korean peninsula through Liaodong and across to Shandong became a corridor of intense interest. Control of harbors and railways along that corridor looked like the key to securing the home islands and projecting power. When Russia soon leased Port Arthur from China and began building lines into Manchuria, Japanese officers saw in steel and stone the shadow of the triple intervention returning with claws. War had also deepened the marriage between industry and arms. Indemnity silver entered Japanese banks. Shipyards laid keels for armored cruisers and battleships. Private mills expanded capacity with new machinery. Railway companies plotted lines from ports into the interior. The state encouraged standardization, technical schools added courses in metallurgy and civil engineering, and the press celebrated inventors and engineers alongside admirals. The idea of a rich nation and a strong army, once a slogan, now felt like a lived cycle in which victory funded growth and growth promised future victories. It was a powerful loop, but it depended on access to markets and resources far beyond the home islands, tying strategy ever more tightly to continental footholds. After the humiliation of the Triple Intervention, Japan's leaders watched the northern continent with cold clarity. Russia had moved swiftly to occupy the vacuum, leasing the Liaodong Peninsula from the Qing court, fortifying Port Arthur, and extending the iron spine of the Trans-Siberian Railway toward Manchuria. The peninsula that Japan had been forced to return now bristled with Russian guns and rails. In Tokyo, the lesson was stark. Only a stronger navy, a larger army, and a firm diplomatic anchor could prevent a repeat. An alliance with Britain brought that anchor. It did not guarantee intervention, but it discouraged France from joining Russia in any war, and it gave Japan political room to act. Two questions framed the crisis. First, would Russia recognize Korea as falling within Japan's sphere of special interest, given the peninsula's proximity to the home islands? Second, would Russia withdraw from Manchuria as it had once promised after the Boxer upheavals subsided? Negotiations dragged on, and each season brought more Russian rail spurs, more garrisons, and more hesitation in St. Petersburg. Prime Minister Katsura Taro and Foreign Minister Kimura Jutaro concluded that delay favored the empire with deeper pockets and longer frontiers. The Japanese General Staff presented plans that leaned on speed. Strike before Russian reinforcements could traverse a continent, seize naval advantage, secure Korea, and then bring pressure through coordinated land and sea campaigns. War opened in winter. Without a formal declaration, Japanese destroyers launched a night attack on the Russian fleet anchored outside Port Arthur, damaging several capital ships and unbalancing Russian command in the Far East. Within days, troops landed along the Korean coast and moved north to occupy Seoul and strategic passes, establishing the logistical corridor that would feed the army for the duration. These first moves expressed the strategy in miniature. Take initiative at sea, deny the opponent freedom to maneuver, and use that maritime edge to shuttle divisions where roads and rails were poor. At Port Arthur, the Navy under Admiral Togo Heihachiro kept pressure on the harbor mouth with mines and bombardment, while the army moved onto the Liaodong Peninsula. The commander of the Third Army, Nogi Marisuke, carried the heavy task of reducing the fortress. Port Arthur was no ordinary base. It was a layered complex of hills, forts, and coastal guns supported by torpedo craft and minefields. The Japanese assaults were bloody and, at first, poorly coordinated. Siege lines crept forward through trenches cut into frozen ground. Engineers tunneled under fortifications, packed charges, and blasted breaches. The capture of the key position known as the Great Hill allowed observers to direct plunging fire onto ships inside the harbor. Under that rain of shells, Russian vessels were sunk at their moorings or scuttled to block channels. After months of attrition, the garrison capitulated. The fall of Port Arthur removed the strongest Russian bastion in the theater and freed Japanese divisions for operations further north. While the siege ground on, field armies met along the rail-fed corridor that ran through Manchuria. The first major engagement at Liaoyang tested whether Japan could sustain offensive action far from its bases. Careful staff work, shorter supply lines by sea to nearby ports, and a doctrine of outflanking attacks helped push Russian forces to retreat. At the Sha River and later at Sandapu, Winter weather, exhaustion, and the arrival of better-supplied Russian corps slowed momentum. Each side learned. Japanese commanders refined coordination among infantry, artillery, and the new machine guns. Russian staffs improved entrenchment and counterattacks. The great decision came at Mukden. There, in late winter, both armies maneuvered over vast fields and villages. Japanese columns extended wide to threaten the flanks, while central formations held hard-won lines. After weeks of combat, the Russians withdrew north, saving the core of their field army but ceding Manchuria's southern belt. For Japan, the battle confirmed that meticulous preparation, relentless movement, and the telegraph's thin wires could translate into victory even against a larger continental opponent. At sea, the war hinged on whether Russia could concentrate its fleets. With Port Arthur's squadron shattered, hopes turned to a relief force sent from the Baltic under Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky. The voyage was an epic of logistics, coal, and diplomacy, spanning oceans and touching ports that viewed the armada with suspicion. An incident in the North Sea, where Russian ships fired on British trawlers in panic, nearly widened the war. The alliance and careful diplomacy contained it. Months later, the fleet approached the waters between Korea and Japan, seeking to reach Vladivostok. Admiral Togo waited in the Tsushima Strait. His plan was simple in shape and sophisticated in execution. Use speed and gunnery to cross the enemy's path, concentrate fire on the head of the column, and maintain formation discipline. When the fleets met, Japanese shells found their marks repeatedly. Superior optics, training, and centralized fire control told over raw tonnage. The Russian line disintegrated, ships burned or capsized. Survivors were rescued from the waves. The victory at Tsushima was so complete that it shocked naval observers worldwide and instantly changed calculations about armored fleets, wireless coordination, and the value of highly trained crews. Cause and effect linked every theater. Conscript training at home delivered divisions that could absorb losses and keep cohesion. The alliance narrowed diplomatic risks and eased the import of supplies. Merchant fleets subsidized in peacetime shuttled troops in wartime. Education policy that had emphasized arithmetic and discipline produced clerks and quartermasters who could track rations, wagons, and rail cars. Industrial policy that had incubated shipyards and foundries yielded shells, boilers, and rails manufactured under tighter tolerances than a decade earlier. The General Staff transformed data into plans. Those plans became synchronized marches, minefields, and barrages. War finance mattered as much as strategy. The Treasury floated domestic bonds, tightened taxes, and, crucially, secured loans in London and New York. Bankers who initially doubted Japan's staying power were reassured by battlefield results and by the government's record of fiscal stabilization. American financiers, encouraged by diplomatic intermediaries, extended credit that kept ammunition and coal flowing. The ability to borrow abroad at tolerable rates was a new kind of weapon. It sustained operations months longer than reserves alone could have done and signaled to neutral capitals that Japan was a serious, solvent power. The human dimensions of the conflict were unavoidably present. Letters from the siege front spoke of mud, disease, and the terror of climbing slopes under machine gun fire. Diaries from naval crews described watch standing through storm and spray, the stench of coal dust, and the moment when a salvo struck home and a hostile mast vanished in smoke. Medical services learned hard lessons in sanitation and triage. The press at home carried photographs and lithographs that translated distant geography into recognizable faces and hills, building a shared narrative of sacrifice. At shrines and neighborhood halls, communities collected contributions for the wounded and the bereaved. Russia's internal politics bent under the strain. News of defeat compounded grievances already simmering over labor rights, peasant land hunger, and political repression. Strikes, mutinies, and demonstrations rippled through cities and garrisons. The Tsarist regime conceded a consultative assembly and limited civil freedoms in response to what became an empire-wide upheaval. Japan had not set out to trigger social turmoil within its opponent, but the connection was inescapable. Military reversals reduced prestige, weakened authority, and weakened authority forced concessions. The reverberations would echo for years. By summer, both governments faced limits. Japan had won spectacular victories, but its manpower was not infinite, and its treasury was strained. Russia still possessed depth in the West, but the road to bringing those resources east was long and vulnerable. In this balance of exhaustion, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt offered mediation. Envoys met in a New England port to bargain. Foreign Minister Kimura sat across from Sergei Vita, a seasoned Russian statesman sent with a mandate to concede little in the face of military defeat. The negotiations were brisk and at times bitter. Japan sought recognition of its special position in Korea, control over key leases and railways in southern Manchuria, a transfer of the southern half of Sakhalin Island, and a large indemnity. Russia refused to pay indemnities and resisted territorial humiliation beyond what battlefield realities compelled. The Treaty of Portsmouth reflected these constraints. Russia recognized Japan's paramount interests in Korea. It transferred to Japan the lease of the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur and Dalian, and the southern stretch of the Chinese Eastern Railway that ran through that zone. It ceded the southern half of Sakhalin. There was no monetary indemnity. For Japan, the terms legitimated its strategic aims in Korea and Manchuria and provided railway revenue and a defensible island frontier. For Russia, the absence of indemnity and the retention of northern Sakhalin allowed the government to claim that it had preserved core dignity. Roosevelt's brokerage won him international acclaim and gave the United States a stake in Pacific balances that would matter in later decades. Back in Tokyo, the political reaction was complex. Many citizens, primed by victories and by the memory of indemnities after the war with the Qing, expected cash reparations. When they learned there would be none, crowds poured into the streets in what would become the Hibiya riots. Police boxes, government buildings, and newspaper offices were attacked. Troops restored order only after days of unrest. The episode revealed the new power of public opinion in a constitutional order, with a popular press and staged ceremonies of national unity. It also underscored the sobering arithmetic of modern war. Triumph could coexist with limits, and diplomatic compromise could look like defeat to a public that had paid in blood. Internationally, Japan emerged with a reputation transformed. Observers in Europe and the Americas, who had doubted that a non-Western state could defeat a great European power, revised their assumptions. Military academies studied the siege operations and the fleet actions. Journalists coined phrases about an awakening East. The victory unsettled racial hierarchies built into imperial ideology and inspired reformers and nationalists across Asia. Yet, it also fed anxieties among colonial powers who now viewed Japan as both a potential partner and a rival. Strategic conversations in London, Berlin, Paris, and Washington began to include a simple new premise. This island nation could act decisively at distance. The consequences for strategy were immediate. With Port Arthur and the southern Manchurian Railway under Japanese control, planners envisioned a network of fortified positions and rail spurs that would secure supply and influence on the continent. The Army refined doctrines for winter campaigning and for combined operations with the Navy. The Navy drew lessons about gunnery, armor, and coal logistics that shaped new classes of ships. Civil ministries prepared to manage railway zones, customs, and police beyond the home islands, blending military and civilian rule in ways that would become a hallmark of later expansion. Korea now stood in the foreground. Throughout the war, Japan had established a protectorate-like presence in Seoul, citing the need to secure lines of communication and suppress espionage. The treaty's recognition of Japanese primacy cleared the remaining legal underbrush. Diplomats pressed new agreements that tightened control over foreign relations and internal reforms in the peninsula. Advisors replaced ministers, gendarmes shadowed officials, railway surveys laid down tracks of influence as surely as steel. The logic that had begun with security concerns now moved toward incorporation. At home, elites debated how to manage success. Some urged consolidation, invest indemnity-like revenues from rail operations, absorb lessons, and avoid overreach. Others argued that momentum must be maintained, that prestige once gained must be converted into formal authority before rivals regrouped. The emperor's image, already burnished by reviews and proclamations, became the moral glue binding these projects. School ceremonies, shrine rituals, and public monuments kept the memory of the fallen before citizens and connected sacrifice to the expanding map. Japan's victory over the Russian Empire cleared the diplomatic underbrush around the Korean peninsula. What had been argued as a matter of security during wartime now became a program of rule. With international recognition of Japanese primacy in Korea secured, Tokyo moved to convert influence into institutions and institutions into sovereignty. The story that follows is not a repeat of battle reports. It is the story of how a modern empire was built on the ground, how Koreans resisted, and how those struggles reshaped Japan's state and reputation. The first step was the protectorate. Under enormous pressure, Korean officials signed a treaty that transferred foreign affairs to Japan and established a residency general in Seoul. The post went to Ito Hirobumi, a central architect of Japan's constitutional order. His mission combined diplomacy, supervision, and reform. Japanese advisors were inserted into key ministries. Treaties and tariffs were negotiated from Tokyo. Telegraphs and railways, previously instruments of war, were now tools of administration. The logic was simple. If Korea was the corridor through which any continental threat might reach the home islands, then Japan must restructure the peninsula so that its finances, police, and transport served imperial strategy. Reform from above confronted entrenched realities. Korea possessed its own court factions, local notables, and networks of influence. Resistance appeared in petitions and in the streets. Student groups and Confucian scholars denounced the protectorate. Guerrilla bands, known as righteous armies, took to the hills and raided police posts and railway lines. Tokyo's answer was a colonial security apparatus. Gendarmes fanned through towns and villages with broad arrest powers. Courts and prisons were reorganized to expedite cases of sedition and banditry. The price of order was surveillance, permits for meetings, censorship of newspapers, and regular reporting by local officials to the Residency General. At the same time, the protectorate pushed through administrative standardization. Land and household registers were updated, weights and measures were aligned with Japanese norms, and a modern fiscal system was introduced to capture revenue. Rail policy advanced quickly. Trunk lines stitched the peninsula from north to south and from the capital to strategic ports. Stations became new nodes of authority, with police boxes, post offices, and warehouses planted beside platforms. This network made it possible to move garrisons in days rather than weeks, to funnel rice and coal toward export, and to project the state into districts that had previously been controlled by local magnates. Education policy provided another lever. The protectorate founded schools that taught arithmetic, hygiene, and basic literacy alongside loyalty to the emperor. Japanese language instruction advanced year by year. Textbook committees screened content for patriotic and moral tone. Scholarships sent a small number of students to Japanese universities, creating a cohort that could staff offices but that also sometimes returned with sharpened political ideas. Mission schools and private academies continued to operate under license, providing spaces where alternative visions of modernity survived. The legal framework of rule hardened in the final act of annexation. After a dramatic event on a railway platform in Manchuria, where a Korean nationalist shot Ito Hirobumi, the balance within Tokyo tipped toward direct rule. Annexation followed. The Residency General was replaced by a government general, headed by a governor-general who combined the powers of a viceroy with those of a military commander. Civilian politicians in Tokyo had little say over the peninsula's day-to-day administration. Authority flowed from the emperor through the army ministry to the colonial capital. Once annexation was complete, the the government general moved to define the colonial state's core programs. A comprehensive land survey aimed to map every field, stream, and path. Surveyors measured plots, checked claims, and issued title deeds. Officials presented the survey as the rational foundation of taxation and development. For many Korean households, however, formalization cut two ways. Long-standing customary rights that had never been recorded could be denied. Debts, once blurred by patrimonial practice, became enforceable against titled land. Ownership concentrated in the hands of those with cash and connections, including Japanese settlers and companies. The survey's cause and effect chain was therefore stark. The government's need for predictable revenue produced legal clarity. Legal clarity produced dispossession for some and investment opportunities for others. Economic strategy privileged exports that fit metropolitan needs. Rice procurement rose as agronomists and model farms promoted new seeds, fertilizers, and irrigation techniques. Where yields increased, tax receipts followed, and shipments of grain to the home islands grew. Coal mines in the north and new hydroelectric projects fed factories that processed cotton yarn, fertilizer, and chemicals. Railway companies, often tied to Japanese conglomerates, built spurs to mines and mills, integrating districts that had previously been economically distant. Customs regulations and shipping subsidies favored carriers based in Osaka and Kobe, making colonial commerce a tributary of metropolitan industry. Policing and courts kept pace with development. Special laws gave the governor-general powers to issue ordinances without legislative debate in Tokyo. Press rules banned articles deemed harmful to public order, a category defined elastically to include nationalist essays and labor agitation. Assemblies required permits. Leaders who spoke too plainly found themselves before judges appointed by the colonial administration. Torture was officially forbidden but persisted in interrogations, as later investigations and testimonies would reveal. The message to officials was unambiguous. Results mattered, and results were measured in quiet streets, balanced budgets, and full rice shipments. Culture and ritual served the project of legitimation. Shinto shrines rose in provincial towns. Civic ceremonies taught schoolchildren to bow toward Tokyo and to recite moral maxims linking filial piety to imperial loyalty. Street names changed. Monuments honored Japanese soldiers and administrators. Yet cultural policy did not eradicate Korean identity. Newspapers under censorship still found ways to report on literature and history. Churches and private academies became refugees for national memory. The more colonial rule promoted a single imperial story, the more alternative stories circulated in subdued but persistent ways. Migration deepened the transformation. Japanese settlers arrived as officials, teachers, shopkeepers, engineers, and farmers. In the capital's business districts, banks from Tokyo opened branches, insurance offices sold policies, department stores advertised goods that catered to new tastes. Settlers brought their own associations and neighborhood watch systems, which often reinforced police authority. Meanwhile, Korean workers traveled in the other direction, seeking wages in metropolitan factories, shipyards, and construction sites. These movements braided the two economies together, but did so on unequal terms. Resistance never disappeared. The righteous armies faded under pressure, but underground networks survived. Students read banned pamphlets, labor organizers linked wages to dignity. Reformist landowners drafted petitions rather than pick up rifles. Some educated Koreans tried to use the colonial legal system to press lawsuits and to claim space for civil society. Others looked outward, founding independence groups in Manchuria, Shanghai, and the United States. The diaspora carried leaflets and speeches across borders that the government general could not police as easily as a village square. The Great War in Europe created new opportunities and strains. With European shipping busy and factories devoted to munitions, demand for Asian goods surged. Japanese firms expanded exports of textiles, machinery, and consumer goods. Colonial Korea both supplied raw materials and gradually built light industries to process them. Wartime profits financed new plants and urban amenities in the peninsula's larger cities. Yet prosperity was uneven. Tenant farm families faced rising rents, food prices climbed in towns, and wartime speculation enriched merchants linked to colonial contracts. The international situation also emboldened diplomacy. Tokyo issued demands to the Chinese Republic that, if fully accepted, would have given Japan a dominant position in Chinese economy and politics. Although the most sweeping clauses were later watered down, the episode signaled a broader ambition that looked beyond Korea toward the continent. By the closing years of the war, a new mood had taken hold across the world. Leaders spoke of self-determination. Newspapers printed speeches that promised a fairer order. In Korea, intellectuals and religious figures watched carefully. When the aged king of the former dynasty died, a wave of mourning provided a public occasion to gather. Activists drafted a declaration of independence, careful in language and firm in purpose. Students carried copies through city streets. Merchants closed their shops. Rural villages held readings in yards and courtyards. The movement that followed was spontaneous in some places and organized in others, but its spread was extraordinary. Crowds filled squares with cries for national dignity and nonviolent change. The government general answered with arrests, beatings, and shootings. Gendarmes charged demonstrators. Prisons overflowed. Trials by the hundreds delivered swift sentences. The crackdown stopped the marches, but it could not erase what the movement had revealed. That beneath the imposed quiet, a nation had retained its voice and networks. International missionaries and journalists reported the repression, and foreign publics, long inclined to view Japan as a disciplined modernizer, began to weigh that image against accounts of colonial violence. In Tokyo, senior officials concluded that the police-heavy posture had turned a political problem into a moral indictment. Policy shifted. The new line, labeled as cultural rule, promised a lighter hand. Military gendarmes were replaced in many districts by civilian police. Censorship rules remained, but newspapers were allowed a somewhat wider range. The government general announced plans for limited local councils and for reforms in education that would expand schooling in the Korean language alongside Japanese. Some political prisoners were released. These moves did not dismantle the colonial state, but they adjusted its presentation and tactics. The strategic calculation was clear: reduce the visible footprint of coercion, co-opt moderates, and isolate radicals, all while preserving the core economic and security programs that mattered to Tokyo. The decade and a half from protectorate to cultural rule left deep marks. Korea's landscape had been remapped by rails, survey markers, and police stations. Its economy had been reorganized around exports that suited metropolitan priorities. Its schools had taught new subjects and imposed new rituals, even as they sometimes nurtured the very literacy that fed nationalism. Its people had tested both armed resistance and mass nonviolent protest, discovering capacities and limits that would inform later generations. For Japan, the experience delivered mixed lessons. Administratively, the empire learned how to run a complex colony. Politically, it learned that repression alone could not silence a nation in an age of newspapers and international scrutiny. Strategically, it learned that colonies could be both assets and liabilities, enriching the metropolis while exposing it to criticism and to the burdens of constant security. When a European war erupted in late summer of 1914, Japan's leaders saw both risk and opportunity. The alliance with Britain, framed years earlier to balance Russian power, now offered a legal doorway into the conflict. The cabinet declared war on Germany not to send armies to the Western Front, but to strike at German possessions in Asia and the Pacific. The Navy escorted troop ships to the Shandong coast, where a combined force besieged the German-held port of Qingdao. Japanese ships also fanned across Micronesian waters to occupy scattered island bases from the Carolines to the Marshalls and the Marianas. These swift moves removed a rival's anchorages, extended Japan's maritime reach, and required little sacrifice compared with the immense bloodletting in Europe. War created a trade windfall. with European factories consumed by munitions and blockades disrupting usual routes. Merchants in Osaka and Yokohama found new markets for textiles, metal goods, and ships. Orders surged. Mills ran day and night. Shipyards hammered out freighters and naval auxiliaries. Bankers financed exports, and the currency's credibility, hard-won through earlier austerity, attracted capital. The state had not planned this boom, but it moved quickly to harness it. Tariffs, shipping subsidies, and procurement contracts favored firms that could scale. In the space of a few years, Japan shifted from a debtor nation to a creditor in parts of Asia, lending to Chinese warlords and to businesses eager to import machinery. Diplomacy advanced in parallel. Early in the war, Tokyo presented Beijing with a list of demands. Some items were framed as protection of existing rights in the Shandong leasehold and the southern Manchurian railway zones. Others sought new economic privileges and advisory roles inside China's government. The most intrusive group would have transformed China's sovereignty into a shadow of its old form. Under pressure and divided at home, Beijing accepted many but not all clauses after months of wrangling. The compromise satisfied no one completely. In China, intellectuals and students denounced the humiliation and blamed both Japan and their own divided politicians. In Japan, hardliners argued that the government had retreated. Moderates worried that overreach would isolate the country. The episode mattered beyond the paper it produced. It signaled that Tokyo was prepared to use wartime leverage to secure peacetime influence, and it planted seeds of resentment that would later blossom into mass protest across China. On the home front, the boom had winners and losers. Owners of mills and shipyards counted profits, urban wages rose, new suburbs appeared along tram lines. But inflation galloped faster than pay for many. Rice, the staple, became expensive as speculators hoarded and as shipments followed higher-priced contracts. In coastal towns where families relied on purchased grain, anger boiled over into the famous rice riots of the late 19-teens. Crowds stormed warehouses and town offices. Police wavered between negotiation and force. The government fell, replaced by a cabinet led by Hara Takashi, the first commoner and the first true party politician to become prime minister. His ascent marked a turning point. The Genro, the elder statesman of the Restoration generation, still advised the throne, but day-to-day governance shifted toward party cabinets that needed to manage the diet, court public opinion, and trade budgets for support. Hara's approach was pragmatic. He sought to normalize party rule, extend railways, and make administrative appointments through his political network rather than by military fiat. He also pushed for measured social reform. Prefectural assemblies gained a bit more weight. Education received more funds. Urban services improved. In the countryside, however, tenants and landlords fought over rents as prices swung with the global market. Tenant unions formed, strikes spread in industrial towns, and a new vocabulary of rights, labor rights, women's rights, and civil freedoms, entered newspapers and cafes. The Taisho era became associated with a broadening of social space. Magazines debated literature and politics, theaters experimented with modern staging, and student circles discussed democracy with an intensity that would have been impossible a generation earlier. Cultural life intertwined with politics. Publishers translated new works from Europe and America. Poets and novelists described city life, factory rhythms, and the inner lives of women and workers. Women's groups petitioned for legal changes, arguing that a modern nation could not ignore half its citizens. Their meetings were often watched by police, and organizers sometimes faced arrest, but the genie of public debate could not be put back in the bottle. Cinema houses spread from port districts to inland towns, showing newsreels of European battlefields and domestic scenes of prosperity and protest. The press carried serialized fiction beside editorials that lambasted the price of rice or demanded reforms. In such a climate, the idea of politics as the property of a narrow elite began to erode. The war's end brought Japan to the peace conference in Paris with claims and expectations. Delegates sought formal recognition of possession over the German islands in the Pacific and the transfer of German rights in Shandong. They also backed a bold proposal for a racial equality clause in the covenant of the new League of Nations. The clause won a majority in committee but failed due to procedural maneuvering by great powers unwilling to accept its implications for their own immigration and colonial policies. In Tokyo, the failure stung. It confirmed a suspicion that the so-called family of nations spoke of equality while practicing hierarchy. Yet Japan did secure mandates over the Micronesian islands and received German holdings in Shandong, at least on paper. That latter outcome provoked fury in China and contributed to the May 4th movement, a nationwide surge of student protest and cultural ferment that targeted both foreign impositions and domestic feudal habits. The naval question soon dominated strategy. The wartime building program had given Japan a fleet formidable in regional waters. But the cost of capital ships, the pace of technological change, and the risk of an arms race with the United States and Britain raised alarms in the Treasury and among reformers who feared that guns would devour schools and railways. The Washington Naval Conference convened in the early 1920s to set limits. Japanese negotiators accepted a ratio that recognized the United States and Britain as preeminent in tonnage, with Japan placed below them but above European continental navies. The agreement forestalled a ruinous competition and, in exchange, recognized Japanese security interests in the Western Pacific. For admirals, the compromise hurt pride but bought time. For ministers of finance and education, it preserved budgets for domestic investment. Another frontier of policy opened on the Russian periphery. After the Revolution and Civil War tore the Tsarist Empire, Allied powers sent forces to Siberia, partly to keep war supplies out of Bolshevik hands and partly to influence the outcome. Japan dispatched troops to the maritime provinces and along the railway east of Lake Baikal. What began as a limited intervention grew into a drawn-out and costly occupation that extended beyond the armistice in Europe. Army leaders justified the presence as a buffer against chaos and as a means to protect Japanese settlers and business interests. At home, critics in the Diet and in the press questioned the expense and the lack of clear objectives. Over several years, Japan slowly withdrew, leaving behind complicated memories and reinforcing a lesson. Land wars on the continent could drain resources and unity even without large battles. During these same years, the architecture of party politics creaked forward. Suffrage remained limited by tax requirements, which kept the electorate small and skewed toward property. Yet organizers for universal male suffrage gathered petitions and held rallies, arguing that political legitimacy required a wider base. Newspapers backed the cause with editorials and cartoons that mocked the narrowness of the franchise. Police monitored meetings, but mostly tolerated them. Cabinet ministers calculated whether widening the vote would help or hurt their parties. Although the final law would come later, the momentum built in this period, and the principle that a modern nation should extend the ballot became difficult to refute. The monarchy itself signaled change. The Taisho emperor's ill health reduced his public role, and the crown prince increasingly took on ceremonial duties. This quiet shift mattered because it showed that constitutional routines could cover personal contingencies without crisis. Ministers presented papers, the Privy Council reviewed decisions, the Diet debated budgets, newspapers reported and criticized. The machinery of constitutional monarchy, assembled in earlier decades, ran with fewer heroic interventions and more mundane procedures. For reformers, this normalization was the essence of what they called Taisho democracy, not the perfection of liberty, but the habit of politics conducted through parties, parliaments, and press. Business organization matured as well. The great conglomerates that had grown through state sales and wartime profits tightened their grip on finance and industry. They diversified portfolios, linked banks to trading houses, and placed trusted managers across subsidiaries. Critics accused them of throttling competition and shaping policy for private gain. Defenders argued that only such concentrated capital could meet the scale of international markets and that the state could always discipline firms through tax and regulation. In practice, the relationship was reciprocal. The state needed investment to build rail spurs, mines, and factories. Firms needed predictable rules and protection abroad. Together, they created an industrial structure capable of high output but vulnerable to shocks. Urban life felt those vulnerabilities. When wartime shipping contracts ended and European factories resumed production, global prices shifted. Some mills cut hours, small banks tottered under bad loans, investors chased quick profits in real estate and stocks. The sense of easy ascent that had colored the high war years began to fade. At the same time, a new generation of workers, educated in primary schools and accustomed to city rhythms, demanded safer conditions and higher wages. Strikes in shipyards and textile mills multiplied. Managers experimented with welfare capitalism, company housing, clinics, and recreational clubs to blunt labor militancy. Police acted as arbiters and sometimes as enforcers. The state's posture remained ambivalent, encouraging industrial peace but determined to keep order. Internationally, the mandates in Micronesia became laboratories of distant rule. Naval officers administered islands where populations were small and scattered. Harbors and runways came later. At first, the burden was health, schooling, and policing. Missionaries, both Japanese and foreign, played roles in education. Anthropologists and geographers wrote reports that doubled as guidebooks for administration. The islands offered little immediate economic profit, but they changed strategic geometry. Bases there, if developed, would extend the Navy's scouting lines deep into the Pacific. Other powers watched and worried, which in turn reinforced naval planning that saw distant islands not as isolated dots, but as stepping stones on a vast ocean grid. The Shandong issue, won on paper at Paris, returned to the table under pressure from Chinese nationalism and American diplomacy. Negotiations concluded in Washington transferred the former German concessions to Chinese sovereignty while preserving Japanese commercial interests and railway rights. Tokyo presented the settlement as proof of its reasonableness and as a gesture toward regional stability. Hardliners grumbled that earned spoils had been traded away for goodwill. Moderates countered that goodwill was a form of capital necessary for long-term influence. The episode hinted at a tension that would stretch into the next decade, whether Japan should anchor its position through compromise and commerce, or through coercion and fate's accomplice. The promise of the Taisho years met its first, brutal test when the earth moved. In early September of 1923, a massive earthquake struck the Kanto Plain, collapsing neighborhoods in Tokyo and Yokohama, bursting water mains, and unleashing fires that raced through wooden wards on high winds. In hours, the capital region was transformed into a landscape of ash and twisted rails. The central government, the army, and municipal officials improvised relief under conditions no drill had imagined. Troops cleared avenues, engineers threw temporary bridges across canals, and telegraph crews struggled to reconnect the country. Amid the organized response, fear rippled through the city. Rumors spread that Korean residents were poisoning wells or signaling to arsonists. Vigilante bands formed and attacked Koreans and, in some cases, Chinese laborers and Japanese socialists. The Home Ministry declared martial law, the army imposed curfews, and police arrested suspected agitators. The catastrophe thus produced two legacies at once: a drive to rebuild a modern metropolis, and a template for emergency powers that fused public order with suspicion of outsiders and radicals. Reconstruction became an opportunity to reimagine Tokyo. Urban planners widened streets to act as firebreaks, laid out parks as evacuation zones, and pushed forward with modern sewerage and water systems. New school buildings rose in concrete, electric lines replaced many of the old gas lamps, and commuter railways extended their reach to fresh suburbs. The state and city issued bonds, private banks underwrote contracts, and construction firms grew fat with work. Yet the burden of debt and the uneven distribution of compensation fed arguments about who benefited from disaster. Landlords and developers seemed to gain, while small shopkeepers and tenants struggled to return. The earthquake had demolished buildings, its shadow demolished trust in some quarters. Security policy hardened in this atmosphere. The government expanded the special hire police, known colloquially as the thought police, to monitor leftist groups, labor unions, and student circles. A sweeping peace preservation law, passed 2 years after the quake, criminalized organizations and speech that aimed to alter the kokutai, the fundamental character of the state centered on the emperor. The law's language was elastic by design. It allowed prosecutors to turn political philosophy into felony, and it gave the Home Ministry latitude to harry publications and meetings that could otherwise claim legality. At the very moment when democratic practice was advancing, the state built a legal scaffold to curb ideas it considered dangerous. That democratic advance was real and significant. In the same year as the Peace Preservation Law, the Diet enacted universal male suffrage. Tax qualifications that had limited the electorate were swept away. The vote extended to millions of men who had never before entered a polling place. Party organizers fanned out with pamphlets and loudspeakers. Rural notables bargained for projects in exchange for support. Newspapers explained ballots to first-time voters. Here was the paradox of the mid-Taisho settlement, a wider electorate paired with tighter surveillance of thought. Cabinets sought legitimacy through broader participation, even as they reserved the power to punish those who used their voices to challenge the imperial frame. Finance then delivered a shock that politics could not ignore. In the spring of the early Showa years, a cascade of bank failures, remembered as the Showa financial crisis, exposed the fragility of credit built on speculative lending during the boom and on reconstruction bonds after the earthquake. Rumors prompted depositors to line up at teller windows. Small banks toppled. Larger institutions merged on emergency terms brokered by the finance ministry and the central bank. The crisis fed a narrative that party politicians were cozy with big business and careless with the nation's savings. It also pushed many small manufacturers to the wall, sharpening class tensions in cities just as rural households faced their own squeeze. In the countryside, that squeeze tightened as global markets turned. Silk thread had tied farm families to world demand, providing cash to pay taxes and buy consumer goods. When the international economy began to slide at the end of the 1920s, silk prices collapsed. Daughters who had once taken pride in seasonal work at mills returned with thinner wages. Some did not secure contracts at all. Rice prices too fluctuated, sometimes hurting producers and sometimes straining urban buyers. Tenant disputes multiplied and police found themselves mediating between landlords and unions in villages that had rarely seen organized protest before. The countryside's distress mattered politically because conscription made the rural household the seedbed of the army. Hardship there translated into a ready audience for officers who spoke of national revival, self-sufficiency, and the cleansing of corrupt politics. Within the armed services, new currents swirled. Younger officers, educated in staff colleges and stationed on continental frontiers, read intelligence reports that depicted a China racked by warlords and foreign spheres of influence. To them, the lesson of earlier decades was plain. Only preemptive and decisive action could secure Japan's position. Some formed study groups that blended military planning with moral critique of urban consumerism and parliamentary bargaining. They admired the discipline of soldiers and the simplicity of farm life. They despised party bosses, zaibatsu financiers, and what they called weak-kneed diplomacy. Their superiors did not always share the zeal, but the organizational autonomy of the General Staff and the Navy Ministry, protected by constitutional prerogatives, gave these currents space to gather. The international setting seemed to confirm their anxieties. The London Naval Conference of 1930 attempted to extend and refine limits on capital ships and certain categories of cruisers. Civilian leaders, led by Prime Minister Hamaguchi Osachi of the Minseito Party and his foreign minister, argued that accepting ratios slightly below the demands of naval hardliners would prevent an arms race the Treasury could not afford. Admirals protested that the agreed tonnage compromised national security and naval doctrine. The dispute, technical on the surface, struck a deeper chord in public life. Who had authority to set the nation's strategic posture, elected ministers or uniformed professionals? Legal scholars debated whether treaty commitments trespassed on the emperor's command over the armed forces. Hardline commentators accused party cabinets of selling the fleet short for the sake of Western approval. Violence darkened the argument. In late autumn of the same year, a right-wing assailant shot Prime Minister Hamaguchi at a central Tokyo station. He lingered for months before dying of complications, and his death was read by many as a martyrdom to the cause of fiscal and foreign policy restraint. For others, it suggested that the center could not protect even its highest officials from men who felt licensed by patriotic rhetoric. Trials produced convictions, but the resonance of the act reached far beyond any courtroom. It signaled that assassins could claim moral motives and find sympathizers in newspapers and barracks. Policing of radical thought intensified as well. The March 15th incident, named for the date of mass arrests, swept up hundreds of leftists, union organizers, and intellectuals. Interrogations were harsh. Prosecutors sought not only confessions of deeds, but recantations of beliefs. Some defendants publicly renounced Marxism under pressure in a ritual called tenko, or ideological conversion, that the state applauded as proof that seduction by foreign ideas could be cured. The spectacle served two purposes. It removed organizers from the street, and it taught the public that the state could reach into the mind as well as the meeting hall. Yet repression alone did not create a political constituency for the government. That constituency grew from patriotic education, youth organizations, and the simple appeal of order during hard times. The media environment changed with the mood. Editors mindful of police visits trimmed opinions. Sensational papers amplified scandals involving party fundraising, bribery, and bureaucratic favoritism. Pamphlets penned by nationalist polemicists sold briskly at tram stops. In the same kiosks, magazines carried breathless accounts of frontier life in Manchuria, describing wide fields, rich soils, and promising towns along the railways. The contrast between cramped, strike-prone cities at home and the imagined expanses across the water fed a colonial romance that mixed economic hope with a sense of destiny. Inside the cabinet system, party leaders struggled to govern. Budget battles pitted social spending and education against armaments and debt service. Tax revenues fell with the global downturn. Finance ministers tried deflation to protect the currency. Exporters protested that a strong yen strangled sales. Bankers warned of defaults. Labor unions demanded relief. Each compromise annoyed someone powerful. The emperor, now in the Showa era after the passing of his father, remained a symbol above the fray. But courtiers and elder statesmen watched anxiously as cabinets came and went with dizzying speed. Political instability made it easier for military ministries to assert that only they could provide continuity on matters of defense. Abroad, the Chinese political scene seemed to invite intervention. A nationalist government in Nanjing declared its intention to unify the country and revise unequal treaties. Northern warlords bargained with foreign powers and with each other, trying to hold local autonomy against southern offensives. Foreign concessions in coastal cities stood as reminders of lost sovereignty. For officers in Japan's Continental Command, headquartered along the leased railway zones, this flux justified contingency plans to protect rail lines, settlers, and mines. Some went further, imagining that a buffer state on the Manchurian plain could anchor Japan's security against both Chinese nationalism and Soviet power beyond the Amur. The Great Depression amplified every anxiety. As world trade contracted, mills in Osaka ran fewer shifts. Dock workers stood idle. Banks nursed portfolios of bad loans. In villages tied to silk, the collapse was brutal. Reports of poverty and of girls sold into urban servitude became staples of social surveys and newspaper exposés. Relief societies distributed rice and second-hand clothing. Teachers organized soup kitchens for schoolchildren. Police kept order at bankruptcy auctions. In such an atmosphere, slogans about frugality and mutual aid had power, but so did calls to sweep aside a political order that seemed tangled in its own compromises. Ultranationalist societies recruited in this soil. Some were tiny groups of officers and students who met in rented rooms to read tracts and plan assassinations. Others were broader movements that preached moral revival, emperor-centered solidarity, and the smashing of party politics. They practiced intimidation, anonymous letters to editors and professors, staged disruptions of lectures, threats to business leaders who funded moderate groups. A few found patrons among mid-ranking officers who believed that dramatic acts could wake the nation. Police watched, infiltrated, and sometimes cracked down, but line drawing was difficult when the groups draped themselves in patriotic language that echoed official school texts. Within the army, factionalism gained sharper edges. One tendency emphasized spiritual mobilization, agrarian virtue, and a purge of corrupt elites at home. Another stressed heavy industry and close coordination with big business to build a mechanized force. Both agreed on expanding continental leverage. They differed over methods and allies. This competition did not paralyze the service. Rather, it created a climate in which bold initiatives by field commands could be framed as national service even when they strained or ignored orders from Tokyo. The constitutional structure, under which the Army and Navy ministers had to be active duty officers and the services answered directly to the throne on operational matters, made firm civilian control difficult even for determined prime ministers. The long slide from domestic frustration to continental adventure became a sudden plunge on a late summer night in Manchuria. Along the tracks of the South Manchurian Railway, a small explosion damaged a section of line. It was a minor blast, the sort of sabotage that rail guards could normally repair within hours. But officers of the Kwantung Army, already convinced that delay invited encirclement and decline, used the incident as a pretext to launch pre-planned operations. They moved with speed against garrisons of the Chinese Northeastern Army, seized junctions and cities along the rail corridor, and presented Tokyo with facts on the ground. Civilian ministers learned of advances after they had begun. The general's calculation had been brutally simple: act first, explain later. Cause and effect unfolded quickly. The seizure of rail hubs allowed the army to shuttle units along steel arteries it controlled, while Chinese defenders struggled to reassemble dispersed forces. Communications favored the invaders. The South Manchurian Railway had its own telegraph network, stations, depots, and loyal staff. Within days, key towns across southern Manchuria were under Japanese control. Officers packaged their actions in a story of self-defense. The railway was vital to treaty rights and the safety of settlers. Local Chinese authorities had failed to curb banditry and subversion. Therefore, decisive policing by a disciplined force was not aggression, but order restored. Tokyo's cabinet faced an impossible choice framed by the Constitution itself. The services answered directly to the throne on operational matters and could not easily be reined in by party politicians. To censure the commanders risked a confrontation that the cabinet might not survive. To bless their actions retroactively meant abandoning diplomatic positions carefully crafted over years. In the first hours and days, ministers chose ambiguity. They urged restraint in public statements while authorizing reinforcements to stabilize the situation. Ambiguity soon hardened into endorsement as success on the ground tempted even cautious officials to accept the new reality. On the Chinese side, the Northeastern Army's commander hesitated for reasons that were as political as they were military. The central government in Nanjing had been consolidating power after years of warlordism, but its authority over the Northeast remained partial. Orders to resist had to travel through layers of local interest and personal ties. Some units fell back to avoid encirclement, others fought isolated skirmishes and then withdrew. The result was not a decisive battle, but a steady change of flags over stations, warehouses, and yamen. In international newsreels, the appearance of order, trains running, markets open under new sentries, disguised the deeper shift. The legal sovereignty of a vast region was being replaced by an occupation dressed as security. Behind the soldiers moved administrators, police, and businessmen. The South Manchurian Railway Company, already a sprawling semi-state corporation, expanded its role into civil governance. Its surveyors mapped farmland. Its accountants tracked grain shipments. Its security arm partnered with military police to screen travelers and workers. Bank branches from Tokyo opened credit windows for favored firms. Land companies advertised plots to settlers with posters that promised wide horizons and fertile soil. The language of the moment fused development and destiny. Engineers spoke of dams and electrification. Pamphleteers wrote of a continental space that could absorb Japan's surplus people and manufacture the steel, chemicals, and machines that the home islands could not afford to produce at scale. The ideological casing appeared soon after the guns. Army planners floated a vision of a new state that would embody harmony among races and classes under benevolent guidance. They cultivated local leaders who had clashed with the Nanjing government, argued that provincial autonomy was more honest than distant rule, and invoked the region's multi-ethnic heritage as justification for a fresh start. This rhetoric culminated in the proclamation of a puppet state. The last emperor of the fallen Qing dynasty, long in uneasy exile, was invited first as a figurehead and then installed as monarch under a new title. The pageantry masked the mechanisms. Real authority rested with Japanese advisors, the Kwantung army staff, and corporate boards tied to Tokyo. Laws and decrees flowed through channels that linked barracks to company offices and then to ministries across the sea. International reaction was swift and condemning. The Chinese government appealed to the League of Nations, arguing that armed seizure and the installation of a client regime violated both treaties and the spirit of collective security. Western chancelleries, wary of open conflict but concerned about precedent, urged investigation. The League appointed a commission led by a British aristocrat to tour the region, take testimony, and draft findings. For months, the commissioners traveled by special trains, guarded by soldiers and shadowed by journalists. They saw tidy stations and model farms laid out for their benefit. They also saw shuttered newspapers and lists of arrested activists. Their eventual report recognized real grievances about banditry and rail security, but concluded that the new state lacked genuine independence and that Japan had used force in excess of necessity. Tokyo's response balanced lawyering with defiance. Diplomats argued that the commission misunderstood conditions on the ground and discounted Chinese failures to protect lives and property. Army spokesmen said that military necessity could not wait upon committee schedules. Press editors accused Western powers of hypocrisy, pointing to concessions and colonies up and down the Chinese coast. The debate in the League Assembly moved toward a resolution critical of Japan's actions and skeptical of the puppet state's sovereignty. Rather than accept censure that might invite further constraints, Japan walked out of the proceedings, signaling that it would not permit distant votes to undo strategic gains. That step would grow into a formal withdrawal later, but the rupture in this period already told the world that Tokyo was prepared to stand apart from the main instruments of collective diplomacy. Even as these arguments played out in Geneva and foreign capitals, the conflict widened southward in a sudden burst of urban warfare. In the great port city on the lower Yangtze, clashes between Chinese and Japanese forces escalated into days of street fighting, aerial bombings, and naval shelling. Foreign concessions, densely populated and crisscrossed with tram lines and warehouses, felt the shock. International settlements tried to maintain neutrality while sandbagging gates and negotiating ceasefires. The episode ended with a truce that restored uneasy calm, but left bitterness on both sides. For the Chinese public, the bombardment of a proud city underscored the costs of foreign encroachment and rallied support for national resistance. For Japan's Navy, the operation demonstrated the capacity to project firepower far from home bases to protect nationals and interests. For diplomats trying to contain the fallout from Manchuria, it complicated every argument. At home, politics slid toward the edge. Assassins from ultranationalist circles, steeped in a creed that mixed emperor worship with hatred of party politics and perceived corruption, targeted leading figures. The Prime Minister fell to bullets fired at close range by young officers and their civilian allies. Trials revealed networks that connected barracks, reading groups, secret societies, and sympathetic donors. Juries and judges sometimes showed leniency, reflecting a mood that framed the killers as misguided patriots rather than criminals. The effect on government was chilling. Party cabinets, already weakened by economic crisis and the constitutional autonomy of the services, now faced the possibility that decisions could be overturned by gunshots. Senior officers in the Army and Navy learned a cruel lesson. Spectacular disobedience could go unpunished if it marched under the banner of national salvation. The economic logic of the new continental policy hardened in this climate. The Showa Depression had bitten deep into rural households and small factories. Manchuria promised markets for textiles, sources of soybeans for oil and feed, coal for coke ovens, and space for chemical plants. The Army sponsored semi-public corporations to consolidate mines, railways, and heavy industry under coordinated plans. Model villages for Japanese settlers dotted the plains, laid out with rectilinear precision and guarded by militia drilled by officers on rotation. Security operations pressed harshly on Chinese communities judged disloyal. Bandit suppression campaigns swept the countryside. Suspects faced detention without trial. Collective punishments were imposed on villages accused of aiding raiders. Military governors told Tokyo that stability required firmness. Civilian critics objected but found few levers to alter the course. The human consequences were immediate. Refugees fled fighting and forced relocations. Labor was conscripted for roadwork and garrison construction. Mixed communities navigated new hierarchies in schools, courts, and markets. For some settlers, the first winter brought disappointment as supplies ran thin and promises of quick prosperity met the reality of cold winds and long distances. For Chinese officials who chose to work within the new structures, collaboration offered protection and resources, but it came at the cost of legitimacy among neighbors and family. The new state's propaganda spoke of concord among nationalities. Its prisons and gallows told a darker tale. In Tokyo's newspapers, debates about Manchuria framed a larger question: who speaks for the nation? Editorial boards once confident in party rule now hedged their language. Columnists praised the valor of troops while urging prudence in diplomacy. Politicians who argued for retrenchment risked denunciation as traitors to the fallen and the settlers. The emperor remained distant, a symbol invoked by all sides. Courtiers and elder statesmen issued careful statements that affirmed national unity and called for discipline without naming offenders. The line between government and army pronouncement blurred as communiques emerged from multiple offices with overlapping authority. Internationally, the occupation set in motion countervailing currents. In China, boycotts of Japanese goods spread, organized by chambers of commerce, student groups, and labor unions. These boycotts hurt textile exporters at a time when domestic demand was already weak. In the United States, public opinion turned sharply against Japan after images of urban bombing reached newspapers. Congressional voices mulled tariffs and immigration restrictions already severe. Britain, tied by old alliance habits and new economic calculations, tried to mediate but grew wary of being dragged into conflicts by a partner operating on unilateral timelines. Each of these shifts nudged Japan further toward a posture of self-reliance defined as military self-help and economic block-building. The spark that turned a string of border incidents into a continental war came on a humid night near a stone bridge southwest of Beijing. Japanese and Chinese troops exchanged fire after a dispute over a missing soldier during maneuvers near the Marco Polo Bridge. Similar clashes had flared before and been contained by local truces. This time, field commanders hardened their positions, reinforcements moved in, and voices in Tokyo argued that a display of force would compel a quick settlement. Instead, the fighting spread along rail lines and city edges, and within weeks the conflict leaped from North China to the Yangtze Delta, where Shanghai became the stage for a grinding battle neither side had expected to last so long or cost so much. Shanghai drew in divisions like a whirlpool. Chinese nationalist troops under leaders loyal to Chiang Kai-shek concentrated elite units to show that the republic would not yield its greatest port without a fight. Japanese Marines and Army formations landed with naval gunfire support, believing superior training and firepower would break resistance swiftly. Street by street, Warehouse by warehouse, the struggle dragged on. Artillery pulverized districts, refugees flooded roads. Foreign concessions fortified their perimeters to keep chaos outside their gates. The cost in men and material stunned Tokyo. The logic of escalation took hold. To justify losses at Shanghai, planners pushed for a decisive blow at the nationalist capital upriver. That blow fell on Nanjing. Japanese armies approached from multiple axes after the Shanghai front buckled. Chinese commanders withdrew many regulars but left rear guards and local units in the city's defense. When Japanese troops entered, discipline broke. Over weeks of horror, soldiers committed large-scale atrocities, mass killings, rapes, looting, against prisoners and civilians. Foreign missionaries, doctors, and business people created an international safety zone and documented what they could save and what they could not. Their diaries and letters, along with later tribunals, fixed the events in world memory as the Nanjing Massacre. The immediate military goal, seizing a capital, had been achieved. The political cost was enormous. International opinion turned sharply. Chinese will to resist, far from collapsing, hardened. Chiang Kai-shek ordered a strategic withdrawal to Wuhan, a triple-city cluster deep along the river. There, the nationalists rebuilt a defensive line, moved ministries, and rallied morale. Japanese forces pursued, intent on destroying what they viewed as the enemy's last main field army. Battles around the Wuhan plain were vast and exhausting. Heat, disease, and supply problems, on both sides, took a toll. After months of maneuver and bloody engagements, Chinese forces evacuated again, shifting the seat of government to the mountainous interior at Chongqing. The war now entered a new phase. Japan held China's great ports, rail junctions, and coastal cities. China held the interior, the legitimacy of the central government, and a swelling reservoir of national anger. Two political moves shaped this phase. First, the long-feuding nationalists and communists formed a united front against Japan. Nationalist armies carried the main burden of conventional fighting. Communist Eighth Route and New Fourth Forces expanded guerrilla war in the countryside, building bases behind Japanese lines, sabotaging rails, and mobilizing peasant support through land and tax policies. Cooperation was tense and often opportunistic, but the shared enemy kept it alive. Second, the Japanese army installed occupation administrations across conquered zones and eventually sponsored a collaborationist regime in Nanjing under Wang Jingwei, a former nationalist leader who argued that accommodation could spare civilians and modernize under Japanese guidance. The new government gained police and bureaucratic reach in the lower Yangtze and along the coast, but it never commanded the legitimacy or loyalty to end resistance. Japanese strategy sought to convert battlefield gains into economic leverage. A maritime blockade and the capture of river ports aimed to choke the inland capital and starve the war machine of imported fuel, arms, and industrial parts. The Air Force bombed Chongqing repeatedly, hoping to break will by terror and to destroy arsenals relocated to caves and backstreets. Nevertheless, supply lines to the interior proved resilient. The southern roads through Indochina and Burma, and later the high-altitude route over the Himalayas, carried lendable aid and essential materials. Before those later lifelines fully formed, another line mattered most: Soviet assistance. After a non-aggression agreement with Nanjing, Soviet pilots flew missions and tank crews trained Chinese units in the late 1930s. These flows blunted early Japanese hopes for a quick collapse. The fighting in North China took on the character of occupation warfare. Garrisons sat in walled towns, mobile columns chased guerrillas and guarded railbeds. Policies meant to pacify also deepened resentment. Requisitioning of grain strained villages. Harsh mopping-up campaigns punished communities suspected of aiding partisans. In some areas, experiments in rural administration aimed to cut the link between peasants and guerrillas by offering security, model schools, or cheap credit. In others, the iron hand dominated. The contradictory mix revealed a strategic dilemma. Japan needed quiet to exploit resources, but the methods that forced quiet often produced more insurgents. On the home front, the war demanded a new level of mobilization. Ministries consolidated into a planning state. The National General Mobilization Law gave the cabinet authority to direct labor, control prices, and allocate materials. Cartels were encouraged to coordinate production under bureaucratic supervision. Textile mills shifted capacity toward uniforms and bandages. Steel and chemical plants ramped up for shells and explosives. Railways prioritized troop trains over civilian passengers. The press celebrated frugality and sacrifice. Neighborhood associations collected scrap metal and policed black markets. School children practiced air raid drills and wrote letters to soldiers at the front. The slogan of a rich nation and a strong army, forged in earlier decades, now governed daily life. Finance and shipping formed the sinews of this effort. The Treasury issued bonds, leaned on banks to absorb them, and managed currency to sustain imports from Europe and the Americas. Shipyards repaired transports under heavy use, ferrying troops and supplies along coasts and up rivers. Submarines and mines were not yet a major threat, but the sheer distance from homeland factories to inland fronts consumed coal and steel at alarming rates. Each ton of metal sent to rebuild a bridge in the Yangtze Basin was a ton not shaped into a ship's plate at home. The arithmetic of attrition slowly asserted itself. International incidents complicated war management. In the first winter after Nanjing, Japanese aircraft sank an American gunboat on the Yangtze. Tokyo apologized, paid compensation, and punished officers. But the episode deepened suspicion in Washington. Boycotts of Japanese goods spread in foreign markets, hurting exports precisely when the state needed foreign exchange. Meanwhile, Germany shifted support from Nanjing to Tokyo as European alignments changed. While the Soviet Union's border clashes with Japanese forces on the Mongolian steppe culminated in a sharp battle at a place remembered as Nomonhan. There, Soviet armor and combined arms tactics inflicted a clear defeat on a Japanese army detachment. The shock reshaped strategic debates in Tokyo. Advocates of a Strike North doctrine aimed at the Soviet Union lost influence. Voices calling for a strike south toward the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia gained ground. The China War, meant to secure the continent, had instead become the anvil on which grand strategy bent toward the southern seas. At the operational level, Japanese commanders attempted to break the stalemate with large encirclement campaigns. The so-called North China cleanups aimed to destroy guerrilla bases by sealing areas with blockhouses, cutting food supplies, and forcing populations into controlled villages. Short-term calm followed. Long-term control did not. Guerrillas slipped through gaps, rebuilt cells, and returned. Elsewhere, drives down the Yangtze captured cities, but Chinese forces avoided annihilation by retreating before the trap closed. Each successful march extended supply lines, demanded fresh garrisons, and deepened Japan's manpower problem. The army had trained for decisive battles. It found itself policing a continent. China's internal politics also changed under wartime pressure. The nationalist government centralized authority with harsh measures, executing or jailing dissenters and managing an economy under siege. Corruption sapped efficiency. Hoarding and inflation eroded urban living standards, even far from the front. Yet the state endured, and its propaganda, depicting heroic defenders in caves, valiant pilots, and patient civilians under bombs, knit a national identity through suffering. The communists, meanwhile, expanded their base areas by mixing resistance with social programs, gaining reputations for discipline and fairness in contrast to some nationalist officials. The United Front was frequently violated in practice, but it remained a rhetorical glue that prevented a return to open civil war while the external enemy occupied large tracts of land. In occupied zones, collaboration became a daily calculation. Merchants took contracts to supply garrisons. Police chiefs balanced fear and duty. Teachers walked a line between required rituals and quiet preservation of language and memory. The Wang Jingwei regime tried to staff ministries with technocrats and to run courts, schools, and postal services that appeared normal. But tax systems leaned toward extraction, and military priorities overrode civil law. The result was a political gray zone. Some life continued. Resentment simmered. Informers multiplied. Resistance organizers learned caution. Japanese society could not remain untouched by the war's moral burden. Reports of atrocities, even censored, circulated among soldiers' families. Some veterans came home disturbed by what they had seen and done. A few officers disciplined subordinates, many looked away. Others justified severity as the only language insurgents understood. The army's indoctrination emphasized obedience and sacrifice, lessons that sustained battlefield cohesion but dulled institutional sensitivity to the laws of war. Courts-martial punished theft and desertion more reliably than abuse of civilians. These choices mattered. Brutality hardened Chinese resistance and damaged Japan's international reputation, undermining the very political goals the war was meant to achieve. By the turn of the new decade, the military situation had settled into a grim pattern. Japan controlled a crescent of territory from Manchuria through the North China Plain and down the Yangtze Corridor to the coast, with garrisons in major cities and along main lines of communication. China retained vast interior spaces, mobile armies, and active guerrilla networks. Air raids on Chongqing continued, causing heavy civilian casualties, but failing to break governance. Japanese offensives seized new towns, then thinned as fresh fronts demanded men. The army's institutional pride resisted negotiation without a battlefield advantage. The nationalists judged that time and foreign aid favored endurance over concession. Economically, the costs mounted. The home islands faced shortages of raw materials, above all oil and high-grade ores, precisely as armament programs accelerated. Bureaucrats pushed recycling, rationing, and synthetic fuel experiments. Planners sketched a new order in East Asia that would integrate occupied China, Manchuria, and Southeast Asian colonies into a closed economic bloc, supplying resources to Japanese industry and markets to Japanese manufacturers. On paper, the scheme promised independence from Western-dominated trade. On the ground, it required more conquest and deeper control than existing forces could reliably supply. Diplomatically, patience abroad thinned. The United States restricted aviation fuel and key materials, criticized bombing of civilians, and moved closer to China with loans and limited aid. Britain, overstretched and wary, balanced between defending its Asian colonies and avoiding direct confrontation in China's interior. The Soviet Union, after bloodying Japanese forces on the steppe, signed a neutrality pact with Tokyo to secure its eastern flank against surprise, while Europe burned. Each bargain narrowed Japan's options in one direction and widened temptation in another. The army could not finish the war it had begun in China. The Navy argued that access to southern resources offered a way to sustain the continental struggle and to secure the empire's future. By the end of the third year of full war in China, Japan's leaders confronted a ledger that would not balance. The army held long arcs of territory, yet could not force a political settlement. The treasury strained to arm divisions and feed cities. Most of all, the Navy warned that fuel tanks were finite. Without new sources of oil and bauxite, any plan, military or diplomatic, would collapse under its own weight. Out of this pressure came two entwined choices: a turn toward formal alignment with European fascist powers and a push south toward colonial Southeast Asia. Those moves promised security and resources. They also invited the embargoes that would corner the empire into a stark decision between retreat and war on a larger scale. The first step was diplomatic theater with hard edges. In late summer of 1940, Tokyo signed a pact with Berlin and Rome. The agreement pledged mutual assistance if any signatory were attacked by a power not yet involved in the European war. In practice, it was aimed at Washington. The message, voiced by propagandists and whispered in cabinet corridors, was that Japan's position in East Asia should be recognized as a fact, and that coercion by embargo would trigger consequences. Foreign Minister Matsuoka Yosuke trumpeted the pact as the birth of a new order led by three revitalized civilizations. Admirals and many diplomats were cooler. They saw that Germany and Italy could not send fleets to Western Pacific waters even if they wished. The only immediate advantage would be psychological leverage over the United States and Britain. Still, the pact cemented a rhetorical alignment that reshaped how foreign chancelleries read every Japanese move. The second step was military, and it began with a march into a colonial vacuum. France had fallen. Its Asian possession, Indochina, was governed by officials who took orders from a collaborationist regime that could not send help. In the autumn of 1940, Japanese troops crossed into northern Tonkin with the stated aim of cutting supply lines feeding the Chinese government in Chongqing. Airfields and railheads were occupied, and garrisons planted themselves along the frontier. The move fit a pattern developed in China: present actions as police measures tied to immediate security, normalize them with administrative routines, and, once in place, expand the footprint. From these airfields, bombers could reach deeper into China. From these rails, inspectors could watch every wagon headed north. Cause and effect worked both ways. As the army dug in across the border, the United States hardened its posture. Washington had already placed moral and financial pressure on Tokyo, but after the pact and the Indochina move, restrictions deepened. Exports of aviation gasoline and high-grade scrap metal were curtailed. Licenses for strategic materials became tools of diplomacy rather than routine paperwork. Britain, fighting for survival in Europe while guarding far-flung colonies, coordinated with Washington when it could. The Netherlands government in exile, which controlled the oil-rich East Indies through loyal colonial administrators, listened closely to American advice. Tokyo's papers coined a phrase about encirclement by America, Britain, China, and the Dutch. The encirclement was not yet complete, but the ring was tightening. Inside the leadership, argument sharpened into camps. Army planners focused on the Continental War, urged self-sufficiency through a southern resource area that would supply oil, rubber, tin, and rice to a closed economic bloc. Time was their enemy. Stockpiles dwindled. The Navy, guardian of sea lanes and the only service that burned fuel at a terrifying pace, agreed that the South promised salvation, but warned that any push beyond Indochina would mean war with the United States and Britain. Admirals added a brutal arithmetic. Even if southern wells were seized, tankers would have to run thousands of miles under threat. Without destroying the American Pacific Fleet, at the outset, the convoy route could not be kept open. Civilian ministers, led by Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro, hoped that a mixture of agreement and delay with Washington might preserve bargaining space while the South was prepared quietly. Between urgency and caution stood the emperor, reading reports from all sides, conferring with elder statesmen, and insisting that every step be framed as defense of the realm. In the spring of 1941, one diplomatic stroke seemed to widen Japan's choices. Foreign Minister Matsuoka returned from a triumphant tour of Europe with a neutrality pact signed in Moscow. After years of border clashes and mutual suspicion, Japan and the Soviet Union pledged not to attack one another. The agreement freed Tokyo, at least on paper, from the fear of a northern war, while the China front raged and the southern plan matured. Army formations along the Manchurian frontier could be reduced. Rail cars and shells could be redirected south. Yet the pact also carried risk. If Germany later turned on the Soviet Union, Japan would face a decision whether to honor neutrality or join the Northern Strike. Within months, that hypothetical became reality when German troops launched a massive invasion of Soviet territory. Hawks in Tokyo clamored for a pincer from the east. The army, sobered by the defeat at Nomonhan and watching the Soviet response, held back. For the moment, the neutrality pact held, and the southern path remained open. Negotiations with the United States moved in unsteady steps. Premier Konoe proposed a personal summit with President Franklin Roosevelt, hoping that leader-to-leader conversation might cut through mistrust. American officials said that talks could occur if Japan suspended further advances and accepted broad principles. respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, equality of commercial opportunity, and non-interference by force. Behind those abstractions lay concrete demands: withdraw from China, renounce the puppet regime in Manchuria, and abandon coercion in the South. For a government committed to a vision of a new order under Japanese guidance, these conditions looked like surrender. Yet rejection, they knew, would lead directly to economic strangulation. While envoys drafted notes, the army pressed for decisive moves. In the summer of 1941, divisions moved again into Indochina, this time into the southern zones of Cochinchina and Annam. Airfields near Saigon placed the Malayan Peninsula and the Dutch East Indies within easy range. Naval units shared bases with French authorities under tight supervision. Tokyo insisted that these deployments were defensive and temporary. Washington did not accept the explanation. American authorities froze Japanese assets, severing financial transactions. Britain and the Dutch followed suit. Most critically, oil exports were embargoed. The Navy calculated the consequences with icy precision. At current consumption, fuel would last a matter of many months. At wartime tempo, far fewer. The clock began to tick loudly in every meeting. In this new silence of oil, the cabinet faltered. Prime Minister Konoe argued for one last attempt at accommodation. He proposed a formula that would recognize Japanese predominance in parts of China, while promising eventual withdrawal under conditions to be set later. American Secretary of State Cordell Hull, backed by service chiefs, doubted the sincerity and feasibility of such elastic pledges. Hull's final communication laid down a path to reconciliation that required Japan to pull out of China and Indochina and to renounce special arrangements that had defined policy for years. In Tokyo, the document read like an ultimatum. To men who had watched comrades die in the Chinese fields and who believed, as a matter of faith and strategy, that the empire's security depended on the continental glacis and the southern resource area, the terms were unacceptable. Political structure now drove events. Service ministers had the constitutional power to topple cabinets by resigning and refusing to provide successors. The army made clear that it would not serve in any government that accepted American demands. Konoe resigned. The emperor appointed Tojo Hideki, the war minister, as prime minister. The choice signaled that the throne wanted hard discipline and a clear line of command more than it wanted continued parlor diplomacy. Tojo, a stern administrator with a reputation for rigor, promised to continue negotiations even as he ordered full preparation for war. The dual track reflected a consensus. If talks failed by a set point, operations would begin at once on multiple fronts. That consensus took shape in imperial conferences where the emperor, ministers, and service chiefs gathered to approve national policy. Records speak in euphemism, self-existence and self-defense, but the meaning was plain. The South would be taken in coordinated blows against British Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong, against the Dutch East Indies, and against American bases that could disrupt the ocean lifelines. Every plan circled back to the same problem: the American Pacific Fleet. Admirals argued that without a preemptive strike that disabled the fleet, convoys could not run and bases could not be held. The most daring of them, Yamamoto Isoroku, proposed a carrier assault on the American fleet at its Hawaiian anchorage. He understood the risks of waking a larger industrial power. He also believed that only a stunning opening might buy the months needed to fortify a defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutians through the Central Pacific to the Indies. While the Navy assembled air crews and rehearsed torpedo drops in shallow water, the Army refined a timetable of landings that would require astonishing coordination. Troops trained for jungle marches and night assaults on coastal forts. Engineers practiced bridging muddy rivers and repairing captured airstrips overnight so that fighters and bombers could leapfrog forward. Merchant ships were requisitioned, painted gray, and fitted with davits for landing craft. Oilers were assigned to rendezvous points along the route south. Meteorologists studied monsoon patterns. Code clerks memorized call signs. The nation's industrial base, reshaped by years of mobilization, rushed to complete aircraft, tanks, and munitions needed for the gamble. As operational plans matured, home front policy tightened further. The cabinet activated controls that rationed fuel, rice, and clothing. Neighborhood associations enforced quotas and cheered rallies that framed sacrifice as virtue. The press praised simple meals and quiet streets after curfew as patriotic acts. Schools drilled students in first aid and firefighting. Women's groups sewed winter clothing for soldiers bound north and wove bandages for those headed south. Shinto rites sanctified battles yet to be fought. The sense of an irreversible path settled over cities and villages, a blend of fear, pride, and fatalism. Not every voice supported the rush. A few elder statesmen and diplomats warned that a war with the United States could not be won if it became a war of attrition. Business leaders who understood American industrial capacity pleaded for compromise, pointing to the empire's dependence on imported machine tools and specialized alloys. Some naval officers worried that the plan to shatter the American fleet at anchor rested on hope as much as on doctrine. If the blow missed its main targets, the consequences would be catastrophic. These doubts were recorded, but the machinery of decision-making had gathered too much momentum. Each month that passed without oil meant fewer training flights, fewer patrols, and less deterrence. Delay itself looked like defeat. International alignments narrowed choices further. As Germany pressed deep into Soviet territory, Japanese intelligence reported heavy Soviet divisions fixed in the west. The Neutrality Pact therefore continued to serve Tokyo's short-term interests, allowing the southern plan to proceed without fear of a Siberian strike. Berlin urged Japan to attack the Soviet Union from the east. Tokyo demurred, focused on the oil to the south and the fleet to the east. In London, Churchill's government braced for blows in Asia while pleading for American entry into the war. In Washington, the administration strengthened bases in the Philippines and negotiated with Dutch authorities to coordinate defense of the Indies, even as it continued to send notes to Tokyo that mixed principle with warning. The gamble that leaders in Tokyo had weighed for months began before dawn across a vast map. Carrier decks in the mid-Pacific launched waves of aircraft toward a Hawaiian anchorage. At the same time, troop convoys slipped through tropical seas toward British Malaya, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Submarines took station at harbor mouths. Radio operators switched to prearranged codes. The aim was simple to state and hard to execute: cripple the American Pacific Fleet, smash Allied strong points, seize the oil fields and rubber plantations of Southeast Asia, and build a defensive perimeter wide enough to force a negotiated peace on terms favorable to the empire. The first stroke fell from the sky. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers slammed into battleships at anchor, airfields, and fuel depots. The attack was tactically brilliant, coordinated down to altitude and approach angles drilled in secret bays. Several American battleships were sunk or wrecked. Scores of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Yet the blow was incomplete. American carriers were at sea and escaped. Repair shops and fuel tanks, spared by chance and by target selection, would help the fleet recover faster than Japanese planners hoped. Even so, the raid achieved its immediate purpose. It disorganized the enemy's response at the very moment when landing craft were touching sand across a hemisphere. In Malaya, Japanese columns moved south with a speed that surprised defenders. Infantry advanced down the peninsula on bicycles and by foot, slipping through jungle tracks where British commanders had assumed armor and trucks were required. Engineers bridged streams in hours. Light tanks appeared where maps said they could not pass. Air units, operating from forward fields, seized and repaired overnight, harried retreating columns and pounded depots. Singapore, touted by British propaganda as an impregnable fortress, proved vulnerable when attacked from the landward side. Water reservoirs were threatened, ammunition stocks ran low, and coordination broke down among units drawn from across the empire. After a short, brutal siege, the garrison surrendered. The capitulation stunned London and colonial capitals throughout Asia. It signaled that the old imperial hierarchy had cracked, and it gave Tokyo both a strategic harbor and a psychological victory of world importance. Across the South China Sea, Hong Kong fell after heavy fighting along ridges and reservoirs. The colony's terrain favored defense, but isolation and the collapse of supplies made resistance temporary. Japanese troops took the city, and civilians entered a long ordeal under occupation. Meanwhile, to the east, the Philippines became a grueling campaign in 2 acts. Initial landings on Luzon pushed American and Filipino forces back toward the Bataan Peninsula. General Douglas MacArthur withdrew to Bataan and to Corregidor Island, hoping to hold out for relief that would not come. Disease, starvation, and bombardment wore down the defenders. When Bataan fell, tens of thousands of prisoners were forced on a brutal march to inland camps with little water and under blows from guards. Many died along the road. Corregidor's tunnels held out a little longer before surrendering after heavy shelling. The fall of these positions gave Japan control of Manila Bay and opened the route to the southern archipelago where oil tankers waited. In the Dutch East Indies, the core issue was fuel. Fields in Sumatra and Borneo, coupled with refineries at Balikpapan and Palembang, offered the petroleum without which the empire's ships and aircraft could not operate. Japanese forces moved with combined arms coordination that Allied command structures could not match in time. The hastily assembled American, British, Dutch, Australian fleet fought hard but was outnumbered and outflown. Battles in the Java Sea ended with Allied cruisers and destroyers sunk or scattered. Air power from land bases and carriers covered convoys, while paratroopers dropped on airfields to seize runways intact. Oil installations were captured largely usable despite Dutch efforts to sabotage them. Tankers began hauling crude north under new flags and strict naval escort. For the first time since embargoes tightened, Japanese naval planners could imagine fuel stocks rising rather than falling. To the west, an advance through southern Burma cut the overland road that had fed supplies into inland China. Jungle marches, river crossings, and hard fighting toward Rangoon culminated in the city's fall. Indian and British units retreated toward the north in one of the most difficult withdrawals of the war, with disease and monsoon rains adding to exhaustion. The closure of this route tightened the pressure on Chongqing and deepened the strategic value of the airlift that would later fly over the Himalayas. The campaign in Burma also drew anti-colonial currents into the war. Japanese officers courted Burmese nationalists, promising independence under Japanese guidance and training units that would become the nucleus of a new army. Similar overtures stirred in Malaya and the Indies, where anti-Dutch and anti-British sentiments could be harnessed to the idea of an Asian Renaissance under the banner of a new order. In the Southwest Pacific, Japan moved to isolate Australia and to shield its southern flank. Rabaul on New Britain fell after a concentrated assault, becoming a major forward base for the Navy and Army Air Forces. From there, patrols pushed into the Solomons and along the New Guinea coast. The seizure of these positions threatened sea lanes and narrowed the avenues by which reinforcements from the United States could reach Australia. Wake Island, a tiny atoll, briefly became a symbol of resistance when a small American garrison repelled an initial landing with surprising success. A second, larger attempt overwhelmed the defenders. These skirmishes mattered beyond their size. They taught both sides about the tempo of modern amphibious war and the value of fast carriers, radar, and well-trained island garrisons. Japanese naval aviation reached a high point in the Indian Ocean. A carrier task force swept across the Bay of Bengal and into waters off Ceylon, striking British bases, sinking cruisers and an aircraft carrier, and disrupting shipping. For a few weeks, the rising sun seemed to command from the Arabian Sea to the Central Pacific. Yet even in triumph, strategic limits appeared. The raid could not be sustained without overextending logistics, and British codebreakers and reconnaissance adapted quickly. The Indian Ocean operation withdrew after achieving shock, not permanent control. Administration raced behind the armies and fleets. Tokyo proclaimed a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, promising mutual benefit and liberation from Western colonialism. In practice, new regimes were tailored to resources. In the Indies, Japanese authorities courted nationalists while ensuring that oil and rubber shipments flowed. In Burma, independence was declared under a government that leaned on Japanese advisors and gendarmes. In Malaya and Singapore, the military government prioritized order, port operations, and the extraction of tin and bauxite. In the Philippines, a collaborationist government was installed under tight oversight while guerrilla bands formed in mountains and islands beyond easy reach. Everywhere, the logic was the same: secure food, fuel, and transport, suppress sabotage, and recruit local labor and administrators where possible. These policies had mixed human outcomes. In some places, early goodwill toward the Japanese, fueled by resentment of European rule, evaporated as requisitions, forced labor, and harsh policing took hold. In others, local elites tried to use the new order to advance long-deferred agendas, only to find that military priorities overrode civic promises. The rhetoric of liberation clashed with the reality of rice seizures and press censorship. Still, the war shook colonial certainties beyond repair. The fall of old flags and the sight of European soldiers surrendering to Asian troops changed how millions understood power, race, and possibility. Back at sea, one audacious American gesture showed that the enemy's will had not dissolved. Medium bombers took off from a carrier in the Western Pacific and struck Tokyo and other cities in a daring raid. The physical damage was limited. The psychological effect was large. It bruised the government's claim that the home islands were beyond reach, and it pushed the Navy to extend the defensive perimeter even further east to shield the archipelago with layers of outposts. That decision would draw carriers into battles far from shore under conditions where Japanese advantages in pilot training and doctrine would be tested against an enemy steadily learning and rearming. At this early zenith, Japan's position looked formidable on a map. The empire controlled a crescent from the Aleutians through the Central Pacific, down past the Marshalls and the Carolines to New Guinea and the Solomons, across to the Indies, and west through Malaya and Burma. Oil flowed again. Mines and rubber estates resumed work under new managers. Railheads and airfields bore fresh markings. Yet beneath the sweep lay strains built into the strategy. Lines of supply stretched over thousands of miles. Tankers and freighters, although numerous, were finite, and shipyards could not replace losses quickly if submarines and aircraft began to take a steady toll. Army garrisons dispersed across islands and jungles consumed men who could not be easily rotated or reinforced without exposing convoys. Air groups on carriers relied on highly trained pilots whose experience was not easily reproduced by wartime training pipelines. The United States, meanwhile, was mobilizing on a scale that Japanese planners had dreaded. Factories retooled to produce aircraft, tanks, and ships at rates unmatched elsewhere. Shipyards on both coasts laid keels for fleet carriers, escort carriers, and destroyers in long rows. An industrial democracy that had seemed sluggish to anger was now committed to a long war, and its allies were reknitting a global coalition. Britain stabilized its Far Eastern command. Australia became a staging ground for counteroffensives, and Chinese resistance, though battered, continued to absorb Japanese divisions far inland. Japan's initial success had awakened a larger enemy whose resources and distance favored attrition. Operational signs of an approaching shift appeared in the Coral Sea. When Japanese forces moved to seize a forward base that would cover a thrust toward Port Moresby, American carriers intercepted. The battle that followed was a new kind of engagement in which ships never sighted each other directly. Aircraft found and struck at long range, guided by reconnaissance and radio. Losses were heavy on both sides. Japan lost a light carrier's operational capacity and, more importantly, learned that Allied codebreakers and air coordination had improved. The thrust toward Port Moresby was blunted. It was a draw tactically and a strategic warning. The age of unchecked advance was closing. The arc of expansion bent back on itself when the carrier war reached a narrow patch of ocean north of Hawaii. Japanese planners aimed to seize a remote atoll, draw out the remaining American carriers, and finish the work that the opening blow had started. American codebreakers, reading enough of the plan to guess time and place, set a trap of their own. When scout planes finally pierced the morning haze, the clash turned on minutes of confusion and courage. American dive bombers, guided by chance and discipline, struck while Japanese decks were crowded with armed aircraft. in a burst of flame, flight crews, fuel lines, and veteran pilots were lost. Japan still possessed powerful fleets, but the cadre that had trained for years could not be rebuilt quickly. The battle at Midway did more than sink carriers. It cut the thread that connected early surprise to continued dominance. From that point forward, the war became a contest of endurance. The United States could replace ships and aircraft at a pace that startled even its own admirals. Japan, stretched across a vast defensive arc, had to choose how to spend dwindling fuel and experienced airmen. The first sustained test came in the Solomon Islands. There, an American landing on a jungle-covered airfield forced Japan to commit troops and carriers into a grinding series of sea and air engagements. Nights on that narrow sea were lit by gun flashes and burning oil. Japanese destroyers ran supply missions under the moon, swift and daring, but daylight air power and submarines took a growing toll. The airfield, once finished and defended, allowed American fighters and bombers to cut the lifeline. After months of attrition, Japanese forces evacuated. The lesson was brutal. Once the enemy established an air base within striking distance of your convoys, reinforcement turned into sacrifice. A parallel struggle unfolded along the teeth of New Guinea. Jungle, mountain, and swamp punished both sides, yet airfields built along the northern coast became stepping stones for the next leap. American and Australian forces, backed by ever more reliable logistics, pushed westward. Japanese troops fought with determination, but supply lines shrank into foot trails and barge runs subject to air attack. Each forward base lost meant the next one became harder to hold. Cause followed effect with cruel logic. Fewer supplies produced weaker garrisons. Weaker garrisons lost air cover, and without air cover, the seas belonged to the enemy. At sea, American submarines began to choke Japan's war economy. Early in the conflict, torpedoes had failed too often. Defects in detonators and guidance wasted opportunities. Engineers and commanders fixed the problems. New tactics emphasized coordinated wolf-pack attacks, night surface approaches using radar, and bold patrols along shipping lanes from the Indies to the home islands. Tankers and freighters burned in arc after arc. The merchant fleet shrank. Shipyards could not replace hulls fast enough. Every cargo lost at sea was coal not burned in a steel mill, rice not delivered to a garrison, aviation fuel not pumped into a fighter. The island empire, built on shipping, discovered that oceans can strangle as well as connect. American industry fed the change in tempo. Liberty ships and escort carriers slid from ways in astonishing numbers. Escort carriers, small and slow compared to fleet carriers, nonetheless filled the gaps, throwing fighters and bombers over convoys and amphibious landings. New radar sets appeared on destroyers and picket ships, turning night from a safe highway into a radar-lit arena. Air groups rotated pilots home to train replacements, spreading combat experience across an ever-widening pool. Japan, by contrast, kept many aces at the front until they fell, and training pipelines narrowed as fuel grew scarce. Each month that passed shifted the balance further. The Allied way of war in the Pacific now took a distinct shape. Rather than retaking every island, planners chose to leap past strongpoints, seize nearby airfields, and let bypassed garrisons wither. Gilbert and Marshall atolls fell in quick, violent battles that taught Marines and sailors how to coordinate artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support against coral defenses. Engineers turned lagoons into anchorages and strips of coral into runways. From these forward bases, long-range bombers and fighters could strike the next tier, and tankers could refuel the ships that guarded them. Japan's outer ring, so vast on a map, began to crumble in linked segments. The decisive fracture came in the Central Pacific when American forces targeted the Marianas. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not only stepping stones, they were keys that unlocked the capacity to reach the home islands with heavy bombers. Japan understood the stakes and sent its remaining carrier strength to contest the invasion. The fleet that sailed into the Philippine Sea carried fewer veteran pilots and faced an enemy with radar-directed defenses and fighter control techniques honed in earlier battles. The resulting air massacre, remembered by American pilots with a grim nickname, broke the back of Japanese naval aviation. Carriers survived the day, but their air groups did not. On land, the battles were savage. Japanese defenders fought to the last ridgeline and, in many cases, to the last man. Civilian casualties were heartbreakingly high as propaganda, fear, and chaos drove desperate acts. When the Marianas fell, the strategic equation changed in a single sentence. The home islands were now within routine reach of long-range bombers. This new reality introduced a second war over Japan's cities and factories. Long-range bombers first tried to destroy industry with precision attacks from high altitude. Weather and the dispersal of plants blunted the results. Tactics shifted toward area burning with incendiaries, which exploited wooden housing and dense neighborhoods. Firestorms consumed districts in nights of terror. For Japanese civilians, the war that had seemed distant in its first years arrived in smoke, ash, and loss. The government urged evacuation of children, rationed food more tightly, and emphasized civil defense drills. Yet no drill could fully prepare a neighborhood for the roar of hundreds of bombers and the wind of a firestorm. Industrial output fell under the twin pressures of air attack and material shortages brought on by submarine warfare. Back in the Southwest Pacific, a separate Allied command under General Douglas MacArthur drove along a different axis, up the New Guinea coast and then westward to the Philippines. Leapfrogging through lightly held points and building airfields overnight, his forces avoided many strongholds that would have consumed months. The goal was to cut Japan's lifelines to the south and to fulfill a political promise to return to the archipelago. When landings began in late Gulf, the Imperial Navy committed its last major sortie in a sprawling series of battles across multiple straits and seas. Courage and confusion marked the engagements. A decoy carrier force lured a powerful American group north, while battleships and cruisers thrust toward amphibious craft off the beaches. In one episode, small American escort carriers and destroyers threw themselves at a superior force, launching repeated attacks that sowed enough damage and doubt to turn the enemy aside. When the gunsmoke cleared, Japan's surface fleet was shattered as a coherent fighting instrument. Tactically brilliant moments could not reverse strategic exhaustion. Air power over the Philippines introduced a grim new tactic. Japanese pilots, facing radar screens filled with enemy ships and sensing the narrowing of choices, began deliberate suicide dives into warships. The method inflicted severe damage and shocked Allied crews. It also reflected a ruthless calculus. Trained pilots and aircraft were now too few to sustain conventional attrition, and the leadership sought a weapon that could pierce radar and fighter screens with certainty. For Japan, these attacks expressed determination to resist at any cost. For the Allies, they confirmed that every mile closer to Japan would be bought with fire. As the front crept west and north, Japan's economy sagged under cumulative blows. Coal shortages idled factories. Trains ran fewer schedules. Cities rationed electricity. Coastal shipping hugged inlets to avoid submarines and aircraft. The state shifted to emergency governance. The cabinet absorbed functions once dispersed across ministries. Local neighborhood associations enforced blackouts, collected scrap, and organized firefighting brigades. Women and students filled factory benches vacated by conscripts. Rural communities sent rice and sweet potatoes to towns under strict quotas. Even so, malnutrition spread. The home front remained disciplined, but fatigue seeped into every queue and workshop. Strategically, the empire now faced a shrinking perimeter and a narrowing set of choices. Naval leaders argued for concentrating what remained of fleet strength to deliver one decisive blow against an invasion force, a return to doctrines that had guided thinking since before the war. Army leaders urged pouring resources into the Ryukyu chain and the southern home islands to bleed any landing and perhaps buy space for negotiation. A few civilians, some in business and some in the foreign ministry, whispered that conditional peace might still be possible if certain lines were drawn and certain allies appealed to. Yet the political system that might have weighed those options had withered. Party politics had been muted by emergency laws, and military ministries still held key levers. It was easier to plan another defensive line than to imagine a way out. Allied commanders, for their part, debated how to bring the war to a close. One path led through the Ryukyus to the southern home islands by stepwise amphibious assault, combined with tightening sea blockade and strategic bombing. Another envisioned intensifying firebombing and submarine warfare until the economy simply failed. In both versions, the Marianas bases loomed as the hinge. From there, bombers could burn cities, mine harbors, and cut rail connections. The blockade intensified. Submarines seeded channels with mines and waited at harbor mouths. Aircraft hunted coastal traffic. Long-range patrols reported sailings to wolf packs. Imports of oil and food shrank to a trickle. The human landscape changed with the map. In occupied territories, Japanese garrisons isolated by Allied advances turned inward, living off local requisition and fighting in pockets cut off from higher command. Guerrilla movements that had grown in earlier years now emerged openly, harassing outposts and guiding Allied scouts. In the Philippines, resistance groups supplied intelligence that shaped landings and ambushes. In Burma and Malaya, the promise of liberation drew young men into anti-Japanese forces, some aligned with future governments and others with rival visions of post-war power. The political currents that would define post-colonial Asia were forming in the shadow of military retreat. In the final winter of the war, Japan's cities and ships were already losing a slow battle to mathematics. Submarines had strangled the sea lanes. Long-range bombers now reached deep into the home islands. Coal and oil ran short. What remained was the hard descent. In the spring, American bombers shifted from high-altitude precision to low-level incendiary raids that turned wooden neighborhoods into kindling. One night over the capital left vast wards in ashes and rivers choked with debris and bodies. The logic was cruel and direct. Without fuel or air cover, factories could not protect themselves, and homes built close to workshops fed fire as readily as any warehouse. The state urged evacuation and discipline. Neighborhood brigades learned to wield buckets and bamboo pumps. Yet the scale of destruction outran human effort. At sea and on the islands guarding the southern approaches, the battles previewed what an invasion of the home islands might cost. On Okinawa, soldiers and civilians endured weeks of bombardment and close combat. Cave systems and ridgelines were taken and retaken, each yard purchased with blood. Kamikaze strikes tore into Allied fleets offshore, exacting a heavy toll but failing to alter the outcome. The human shock within Japan was profound. Letters from the front described not glorious charges, but mud, fear, and the deaths of neighbors' sons. The cabinet read casualty reports and understood what awaited if the main islands became battlegrounds. Then came the blows that closed choice. In early August, a single bomb incinerated a city in a flash, a force beyond anything staff officers had imagined. Days later, another fell on a second city. Between those detonations, Soviet armies crossed into Manchuria, rolled over the puppet state so carefully constructed in earlier years, and landed in the northern islands, long considered a quiet frontier. The combined effect was decisive. The weapon in the sky promised devastation without warning. The northern invasion shattered any remaining hope that diplomacy might hold one front quiet while the other was fought. Ministers argued in hushed rooms. The emperor listened as service chiefs and elder statesmen presented stark alternatives. He chose to speak. On a hot August day, radios across the country crackled as the emperor's voice, unfamiliar to ordinary listeners, announced acceptance of the Allied terms. The language was formal and indirect, but the meaning was unmistakable. The war would end. Reactions were human before they were political. In factories and barracks, men sat down and wept. In villages, parents stared at portraits on altars and whispered prayers. In the burned capital, people looked up at a sky suddenly quiet. Surrender did not conjure food or rebuild shelters. but it halted the attrition that had become daily life. The occupation that followed was unlike any prior foreign presence in Japan's long history. Allied forces landed smoothly, encountering disciplined compliance rather than street fighting. At the apex stood a supreme commander, General Douglas MacArthur, who combined military authority with sweeping civil powers under directives from Washington and guidance from Allied councils. Japanese ministries remained in place to execute orders, but ultimate authority flowed from the new headquarters in the capital's former governmental district. The arrangement was pragmatic: use existing bureaucratic capacity to rebuild, while reshaping law and politics to prevent any return to militarism. The first tasks were urgent and physical. Demobilization brought millions of soldiers and sailors home by train and ship. Civilians flooded back from lost colonies and former war zones in Korea, Taiwan, Manchuria, and the Pacific, carrying little more than what they could hold. Housing, already scarce after firebombing, grew tighter. Food shortages worsened as transport networks struggled. Black markets sprang up in station plazas and alleys, exchanging rice and sweet potatoes at prices beyond official rations. Allied authorities permitted emergency imports and pressed the government to stabilize distribution. The winter after surrender was bitter, and hunger haunted city streets. Justice and accountability came next. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in a former army building with judges from allied nations. Defendants included former prime ministers, generals, admirals, and ideologues charged with waging aggressive war and with crimes against humanity. The proceedings ran long, with defense and prosecution calling witnesses and arguing over legal foundations unfamiliar to Japanese jurisprudence. Outside the courtroom, separate military trials tried officers and officials accused of specific atrocities in occupied territories and prisoner camps. These processes were imperfect and sometimes inconsistent, yet they marked a break: the assertion that leaders could be held individually responsible for state violence. Meanwhile, occupation authorities dismantled the legal scaffolding of the wartime regime. The Home Ministry's police apparatus, which had monitored thought and association, was stripped of political powers and later dissolved. Ultranationalist societies were banned, the armed forces were abolished, arsenals went quiet, aircraft were scrapped. Censorship shifted from wartime secrecy to occupation oversight, policing praise of militarism and limiting criticism of Allied control. Educational materials were purged of emperor-centered orthodoxy. New civics textbooks emphasized rights, local government, and international cooperation. Teachers who had led militarist instruction faced review. Many remained, adapting quickly to new curricula under watchful eyes. Economic reform aimed to break concentrations of power that had tied industry and state in the war. Land reform became the most transformative program. Under new laws, large landlords were compelled to sell excess holdings to tenants at controlled prices, and village committees helped administer transfers. Ownership shifted on a scale unseen since early modern times, empowering millions of farm families and reducing the hierarchical tensions that had fed rural unrest. In industry and finance, occupation planners targeted the great conglomerates. Holding companies were dissolved, and antitrust measures severed some of the vertical links between banks, traders, and manufacturers. Labor unions gained legal standing, and collective bargaining spread in factories and docks. Strikes erupted as prices rose faster than wages, and the occupation at times shifted from encouraging labor rights to restraining disruptions that threatened recovery. The political centerpiece of reform was a new constitution. Drafting began in Japanese committees but accelerated under occupation insistence that sovereignty must flow from the people rather than from an unchallengeable throne. When ministry drafts proved cautious, the Supreme Commander's staff produced a bold text in English, which Japanese legal scholars translated and refined into natural legal language. The document preserved the emperor as symbol, stripped him of governing authority, established a bicameral legislature elected by universal adult suffrage, and entrenched civil liberties. A short, startling clause renounced war and the maintenance of war potential, turning the nation's defense into a promise to settle disputes by peaceful means. Debate in the Diet was real, with conservatives warning that such renunciation ignored the hard world, and progressives insisting that only a radical break could prevent relapse. The Constitution took effect in the spring, 2 years after surrender, and elections soon filled the new parliament with men and, for the first time, women. Women's suffrage was part of a broader reshaping of social relations. Family law changed inheritance and marriage rules, weakening the patriarchal household structure that had given legal power to the eldest male. Education reforms extended compulsory schooling and revised curricula to emphasize science, social studies, and world literature alongside Japanese history, stripped of imperial myth. Local government gained strength through elected governors and assemblies, reversing decades of central control. These changes did not erase tradition, but they redistributed authority within families, towns, and the state. Recovery remained halting. Inflation ravaged savings, rationed rice rarely met caloric needs, coal production lagged. In the late 1940s, American officials, worried that economic chaos would breed extremism, shifted from punitive dismantling to reconstruction. A tight fiscal stabilization plan, nicknamed after the banker who designed it, slashed deficits, unified exchange rates, and forced industry to live within hard budgets. The pain was immediate. Layoffs, business failures, and a further dip in output. Yet within a year, prices stabilized and the currency regained credibility. An export drive followed, first in textiles and simple machinery, then in more complex goods. Aid through a European recovery program spilled into Asian procurement channels, and American orders for supplies underwrote factory lines. As the global Cold War hardened, occupation priorities tilted. Early purges of business and conservative political figures softened, labor militancy was checked, communist organizers faced surveillance and arrests. The rationale was openly strategic. A stable, capitalist Japan, aligned with the West, would anchor the Northwest Pacific. A new security reality arrived with the Korean War. United Nations forces, led by the United States, fought on the peninsula. Japan became a logistical rear area and a supplier of goods and repairs. Shipyards reopened to refit vessels. Machine shops hummed, ports filled with cargo. This sudden demand jump-started industries that the stabilization plan had left idle. At the same time, Allied commanders encouraged the creation of a lightly armed National Police Reserve, the first step toward rearmament under a name that preserved the letter of constitutional renunciation while addressing the practical need for defense. Foreign policy re-entered through a peace settlement. Years of negotiation produced a treaty signed by many nations in a hall overlooking a bay once patrolled by warships. The terms restored Japanese sovereignty, ended the legal basis for occupation, and settled many, though not all, wartime claims. Some states did not sign. Others normalized relations years later. Alongside the peace came a bilateral security pact with the United States. American forces would remain in bases across the islands, particularly in the South, to provide regional stability and deterrence. Supporters called this arrangement the cheapest insurance for a nation that had renounced conventional armaments. Critics warned that foreign troops on soil would complicate diplomacy and domestic politics for generations. Both assessments would prove true in different measures over time. Human stories threaded through these structural changes. Survivors of the atomic blasts rebuilt neighborhoods with their own hands, carrying scars that later movements would bring to public conscience. Families searched for sons missing in Siberian camps or in jungle graves. Writers and filmmakers wrestled with memory, guilt, and resilience, producing work that refused simple propaganda, neither triumphalist nor wholly despairing. Former soldiers returned to classrooms as teachers or to small shops as proprietors, bringing discipline and a desire to forget or to tell, depending on the man. Children raised in evacuation towns came back to cities with country habits and mixed dialects. The war lived in kitchens and in train stations long after treaties were signed. Sovereignty returned with pen strokes, but post-war Japan's project was not to rebuild the empire. It was to redefine power. The basic bargain that guided the early decades became known later as the Yoshida Line. Prioritize economic recovery and export growth, while relying on the American alliance for strategic shelter. It was a shrewd reading of circumstance. With the Constitution's renunciation of war, and with bases hosted under the Security Pact, Tokyo could direct budgets toward factories, schools, ports, and research rather than toward battleships and divisions. In effect, national strength would come from the balance sheet, not from battalions. A new industrial architecture took shape. Ministries coordinated credit, technology import, and trade protection with an attention to detail that stunned visiting economists. Bureaucrats in the trade and industry portfolio worked with banks and corporate groups to pick sectors, set targets, and funnel loans. Wartime conglomerates had been legally dissolved, yet looser webs of firms and banks, keiretsu, cooperated through cross-shareholding and regular caucuses. The state used tariffs and quotas to incubate infant industries, then pressed champions to compete abroad. This choreography did not eliminate market forces, it redirected them. Companies that met export goals won access to scarce foreign exchange and licenses for advanced machinery. Those that stumbled were nudged to merge or exit. Growth followed. Shipyards sent tankers and bulk carriers down bright-painted slips. Steel mills along bays glowed at night, pouring the plate and coil that would become cars and appliances. Electronics firms climbed the value ladder from radios to color televisions to semiconductors and memory devices. Automakers refined small, fuel-efficient models perfectly suited for crowded cities and, later, for an energy-conscious world. Container ports reorganized trade, while a national trunk of expressways knit islands into a single market. In a symbol that married engineering with national confidence, a high-speed rail line began to race between the political and commercial capitals, just in time for the Olympic Games that reopened Japan to the world. Images of a sleek train and a lit stadium announced a country returned to modernity not by conquest, but by precision and punctuality. Prosperity, however, brought friction. Rapid industrialization scarred rivers and air. Patients in fishing towns suffered strange ailments traced to heavy metals dumped by factories. Lessons in environmental regulation were written in lawsuits and sorrow. Citizens' movements pressed local and national officials to curb pollution and to punish negligence, and over time Japan built one of the stricter regulatory regimes in the industrialized world. Political protest reached beyond the environment. When the Security Treaty came up for revision, vast crowds filled avenues in the capital, demanding a better balance of sovereignty and alliance. The government prevailed, and the pact endured, but the marches left a lasting imprint. Civil society could mobilize at scale and force leaders to justify choices in full public view. Diplomacy rebuilt bridges in Asia with a mix of realpolitik and mea culpa. Normalization with Seoul brought loans and development assistance alongside the hard bargain of setting aside certain claims. For many Koreans, the arrangement felt unequal, yet it opened trade and migration that would boom decades later. With Beijing, a breakthrough came when Tokyo recognized the People's Republic. Commercial ties expanded rapidly as Japanese investment and technology flowed to the mainland. At the same time, memory politics complicated every handshake. Textbook language, prime ministerial visits to a controversial shrine, and the unresolved pain of military sexual slavery kept history at the center of politics. Apology statements by leaders tried to draw a line under guilt while promising reflection and peace. Responses were mixed, and they remain mixed because memory is as much about the present as the past. Energy shocks in the 1970s exposed the vulnerability of a resource-poor archipelago. Oil price spikes sent factories scrambling and households conserving. Policy responded with a national drive for efficiency. Automakers doubled down on compact designs. Appliance makers championed low-wattage offerings. Utilities diversified into liquefied gas and nuclear power to reduce oil dependence. The state promoted research consortia to push the frontier in robotics, optics, and materials. By the close of that decade, Japan had turned crisis into comparative advantage. Energy per unit of output fell dramatically, and export competitiveness rose. Currency politics delivered a different kind of jolt in the 1980s. Agreements among major economies pushed the yen upward, making exports more expensive and imported assets cheaper. Corporations replied with automation, offshoring of lower-value production, and quality upgrades aimed at the premium market. Meanwhile, easy money at home, buoyed by financial deregulation and optimism, inflated prices of land and stocks. Headquarters districts saw plots valued as if each square meter printed cash. Art auctions set records that made headlines. The bubble felt like a permanent condition until suddenly it was not. Tightening policy and shifting sentiment pricked the euphoria. Asset prices crashed. Banks nursed bad loans that took years to recognize and longer to unwind. A long period of weak growth and deflationary pressure followed, a slow-motion adjustment labeled, sometimes too simply, the lost decades. Politics evolved through these cycles. The party that had dominated most cabinets since the occupation's end lost its majority for a time, returned, and then alternated between dominance and coalition compromise. Electoral reform shifted the incentives of campaigning and the mechanics of coalition building. Local leaders in prefectures and cities experimented with technocratic governance and transparent budgeting, seeding a new generation of politicians who spoke the language of policy detail rather than only of factional loyalty. Scandals repeatedly reminded voters that the cozy ties of money and influence never vanish entirely. Periodic realignments showed that institutions could absorb shocks without sliding into paralysis. Society itself changed as dramatically as the balance sheets. Birth rates fell and lifespans lengthened, producing one of the most rapidly aging populations on Earth. Nurses and home care workers became as strategically important as engineers. Pensions and health budgets grew faster than tax receipts. Firms experimented with flexible work, yet the culture of long hours endured longer than many salaried workers' patience. Women's labor force participation rose, though management pipelines lagged behind. Immigration, once minimal, crept upward through trainee programs and special visas, raising new questions about community and identity. In the countryside, rice paddies and small towns emptied as young people left for metropolitan opportunities. Local governments courted tourists and remote workers with creative incentives and revitalization projects, with mixed results. Security policy adjusted within constitutional bounds, then pressed slowly against them. Participation in United Nations peacekeeping missions began under carefully tailored rules. A new self-defense establishment took shape with modest budgets but high technical standards, focusing on air defense, anti-submarine warfare, and disaster response. Over time, governments reinterpreted the pacifist clause to allow limited collective self-defense, arguing that alliance credibility required the ability to aid partners under attack. Each step sparked debate. Critics warned of mission creep, supporters spoke of realism in a rough neighborhood. The alliance with the United States deepened through shared training, missile defense cooperation, and agreed realignments of bases, especially controversial on the southern islands where local burdens are heaviest. Nature kept reminding policymakers that security is not only about armies. An earthquake devastated a port city and tested emergency response. A cult's nerve gas attack in a subway shocked a public accustomed to order. Years later, an earthquake and tsunami triggered a nuclear accident that forced evacuations and a wrenching national debate over energy policy. Each crisis generated its own vocabulary of regret and reform. Building codes tightened, crisis communications improved, command chains clarified, and energy plans reconsidered. Volunteerism surged after disasters, cementing a civic ethic that reaches beyond ballot boxes. Soft power grew where hard power was bounded. Film, animation, design, cuisine, and fashion traveled the world, turning city neighborhoods into global brand names. Consumer electronics and automobiles carried reputations for reliability that other manufacturers chased for decades. Scholars and engineers staffed international labs, artists filled biennial lists, chefs remade diners' expectations. Tourism, once peripheral, became central as travelers sought temples and neon in the same week. This cultural projection did more than sell tickets. It offered a counter-narrative to images of wartime aggression, presenting a society that prizes craft, calm, and detail. Regionally, strategy worked on two levels. Economically, Japan invested deeply in Southeast Asia, building factories that anchored supply chains and providing infrastructure loans that dovetailed with local development plans. Politically, it acted as a quiet balancer, talking to Beijing while supporting maritime law, engaging with Seoul despite cyclical disputes over history and territory, and coordinating with Canberra, New Delhi, and Washington on security dialogues that stop short of formal alliances. The guiding instinct has been steady: avoid dramatic lunges, prefer incrementalism, protect sea lanes and the rules that keep them open. Memory remained contested throughout. Museums, textbooks, and memorial days navigated between mourning and responsibility. Some politicians visited shrines that enshrine the war dead, triggering diplomatic protests. Others stayed away and emphasized reconciliation in speeches abroad. Survivors' testimonies from firebombed cities and from atomic ground zeros built a distinctive moral vocabulary that peace activists deployed in global forums. In classrooms, teachers led units that asked students to weigh historical evidence and to listen across borders. The result is not consensus, but a layered conversation that refuses to end because it should not. By the early decades of the new century, the country stood as a mature power shaped by restraint. Its economy, no longer the fastest growing, remained among the largest and most technologically sophisticated. Its companies excelled in components and materials hidden deep inside global products, specialty steels, advanced ceramics, precision machine tools that give leverage beyond headline market share. Its universities and labs pushed robotics and biomedicine in directions that fit an aging society. Its diplomacy blended alliance management with institution building in Asia. It had critics who said it moved too slowly, and admirers who said its patience was its strength. The long arc from empire to post-imperial power is not a straight line. It bends through trauma, choice, and adaptation. Japan's path since sovereignty was restored shows a country that learned to exercise influence without conquest, to hold an army that does not invade, to compete fiercely in markets while apologizing, imperfectly and incompletely, for past violence, and to turn disaster into reform more than once. That legacy is unfinished. Demographic headwinds, technological races, and great power rivalry will keep testing institutions and imagination. Yet the central transformation endures. The state that once sought dominance through empire now seeks security and status through alliances, law, innovation, and culture. And that is the enduring story of Japan after empire.